Chapter 1 of The Feasting Dead by John Metcalfe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Feasting Dead by John Metcalfe. Chapter 1. Our boy Denis had at no time been very strong, and when his mother, whom he had adored, died suddenly, I fetched him from his boarding school at Edinburgh and let him stop a while at home. Poor little fellow. I had tended previously, perhaps, to be a trifle stern with him, but we needed each other now, and I did all I could to make up to him for anything of harshness in the past, and soften, for his tender sensibilities, the blow I myself felt so sorely. No doubt I had become a thoroughly indulgent father, and would not, I think, have rued it but for that train of circumstances to be narrated. We were living then in the big pleasant old place, Ashtoft, near Winchester, which I had bought on my retirement from the army, and when Denis asked still to stay from school for one more term and keep me company, I was secretly flattered, I expect, as well as comforted. The milder southern air and his daily rides over the downs would do him good, and he would take no harm from missing a few months of Greek and algebra. There was, that May and June, a French family, or rather a father with his young son and daughter, spending part of the summer in the neighborhood, and that Denis should like them and they him I found altogether fortunate. Cecile, my wife, had been half French, and when it transpired that our new acquaintances were not only residents of her native province, but must actually, as we compared notes and worked it out together, be some sort of distant cousins, this chance encountering seemed more than ordinarily felicitous. Cecile had never tired of talking to Denis of Auvergne, its history, scenery, and above all its legends, some of them, she admitted, rather shocking, and we had frequently regretted that as yet he had not seen it for himself. He could, however, read and speak French very tolerably, putting me to a total shame, and now in a variety of loyalty, I fancy, to his mother's memory, who doubly prejudiced in favor of anything or anyone of Gaelic origin. As for these Vaignons, the father, who cultivated us with considerable assiduity, was, I believe, a landowner of consequence, with a chateau not far from Issoire. He was a lean, somewhat nervous yet taciturn man, with sunken cheeks and an unhappy brooding manner, which I set down to his recent bereavement. The fact that he too had lost his wife last year was an added, if unspoken, reason for sympathy amongst us. And I was wholly glad that Denis had the orphaned Augustine and Marcel for his playmates. Truth compels me to confess that they weren't very prepossessing little scamps, being undernourished-looking, swarthy, narrow-eyed, and quarrelsome, but for Denis their society evidently had charm. "This shall be au revoir, and not goodbye, Monsieur le Colonel," said Monsieur Vaignon upon leaving. "For Denis at the least. Denis shall come to see me in Auvergne, if you can spare him, in his holidays, while, to be quits, my own Marcel and Augustine might visit you." Here was a new idea, but when I questioned him, Denis, it seemed, knew all about it. "And would you care to go?" I asked, surprised. "Oh, yes, I may, mayn't I?" "We'll see." "Yes, I dare say," I temporized. "Wait and we'll see." The notion had been rather sprung upon me, yet such holiday exchanges were constantly advertised in the press, and in the present instance there was an already existing acquaintance between the families, to say nothing of a degree, if slender, of relationship. As for holidays, Denis had plenty of them lately, but he would be off to school again nearer home before so long. He had been falling behind, inevitably, in his studies, and now, I thought, he had a golden opportunity of picking up his French. Next August I went over with him to Foint, saw him installed in Monsieur Vaignon's chateau, where I stopped one night and returned placidly enough to Hampshire with Marcel and Augustine the following day. This arrangement remained in force for well over a year, till Denis was 13, being renewed after he had restarted his schooling, through several successive holidays, or parts of them. My boy's persistence and perseverance with the business, I must say, somewhat astonished me. What kind of fun could he have there, I wondered, that so attracted him? Marcel and Augustine, when they came to me as they usually did, could largely amuse each other, but Denis had no one of his own age to play with. Cecile had had a young nephew, Willie, her brother's child, but he had died 2 years ago, or else I thought regretfully my Denis might have looked him up and found him possibly congenial company. Now, even Willie's parents, who had lived within an easy drive of the chateau, had moved to Dijon, and Denis was reduced, as I've said, to Monsieur Vaignon for the supply of entertainment. I was perplexed, and maybe a shade jealous. Thus far, I had had but that one glimpse of the chateau, since it was either Monsieur Vaignon or his majordomo Flebard, who on the next few occasions took the children to and fro, and now still wondering, I tried to recall the place more clearly. The chateau was old and generally in somewhat poor repair, though its interior was pleasing. Its exterior, and the immediate approaches, had been dusk-shrouded when we arrived, but before that I had had to hire a taxi at an exorbitant fare from the nearest station, a dozen miles away, and had had some chance of viewing the countryside between. It was austere and grimly forbidding, with a burnt-out, cindery quality I found depressing. However, that didn't matter particularly, and our effusive welcome from Monsieur Vaignon, coupled with repeated apologies for the breakdown of the car that should have met us, had reassured me, if I needed it. After Denis was in bed, my host and I chatted till midnight over some superlative brandy. There had been from him some laughing allusion to a haunted turret room, but the story attached to it seemed confused, and I could not subsequently recollect it. "Do you still want to go to Font every holiday?" I had asked Denis once. "Why don't you give a trial to Uncle Michel and Aunt Bet instead? They'd love to have you there with them at Dijon." "Oh, no. I like it so at Font. Yes, I do." A quick anxiety in his tone surprised me. Till then I had acquiesced in the arrangement somewhat lukewarmly, though certainly without misgiving. And even now it would be exaggeration to say I was at all uneasy. Simply, I felt that from such slight and casual beginnings, the thing had somehow become too important or endured too long. "But surely you must be terribly dull there sometimes. What do you do with yourself all day?" "Oh, there's a lot to do. He faltered, embarrassedly, and I experienced a faint, disquiet qualm. His delicacy had always caused his mother and myself concern, and at her death I had feared seriously the effect upon his health. But he had borne his share of grief for her manfully enough, and for a while had seemed to benefit from exercise and a respite from lessons. At the moment, however, he was nervously flushed, maybe dreading my vetoing his further visits, and his eyes had an odd strained look, as if the idea curiously struck me he was carrying some sort of burden. No more was said at that time on the subject, and the appearance the next week of escort Flebard, a decent, sober fellow who seemed propriety incarnate, temporarily allayed my doubts. Yet, after Denis was gone, they naggingly revived. What was it at the chateau, I could not stop wondering, that held this strong continuing attraction for my boy? Without exactly scenting anything amiss, I recognized that here was an affair or situation which I had been to blame in not exploring thoroughly, and which at least would bear more careful scrutiny. I resolved that on Denis's next trip, if there should be one, I would again accompany him, or perhaps bring him back myself, and possibly in either case remain with him at Font for a day or so before returning. That visit I remember very well. I remember at its close concluding that no, there really was nothing after all to worry about, and then as a wave of unaccountable depression overcame me, feeling as vaguely puzzled and undecided in my mind as ever. Monsieur Vaignon, pressing me to stop longer than the 3 days I did, had been almost too attentive a host, scarcely indeed permitting me out of his sight. With his own children, of whom next year he would see less, one being entered for a lycée at Bourges, the other for a convent school in the same town, he seemed stricter than in Hampshire, and I reflected wryly that while it lasted, this exchange system certainly gave him the better of the bargain, for there could be no comparison between my handsome, graceful Denis and his two replacements, queer, cryptic little monkeys that they were. For my sojourn at the chateau, it had turned out more convenient to choose not the beginning but the end of a stay there, by Denis of 4 weeks. The hours passed, not disagreeably, until my final night quite unremarkably in talking, eating, card-playing, sheer loafing, and a short series of amiably conducted tours of the estate. Upon these rambles Denis would go with us, not ill-pleased to assist Monsieur Vaignon in the part of showman, and yet, I thought, a trifle distrait and subdued, his bright head glinting on before us in the sun. It was extremely sultry, the middle of August, and the scorched country frowned quiveringly around us through a heat haze. Towards Font, the turmoil landscape was a gross tumble of smirched rocks, like something caught in the act of an explosion, or a more fanciful comparison occurred to me, as if these riven slabs, seared spires and pinnacles, and blackened ingots of fused earth had been the men which sportive devils had hurled down upon the gaming table of the pies in some infernal tourney, and then left in disarray. I told myself I would be very thankful when my boy and I were home. But what had chiefly struck me during my 3 days at this chateau was a peculiar faint change, for all his courtesy, in Monsieur Vaignon. Once when I referred casually to Denis's next visit, a strange, hesitating, and constrained look crossed his face. "Yes," he replied, without conviction. "Ah, well, we all grew up, and the best of things come to an end." That night, the eve of our return to England, I was restless. My feather bed stifled me, and I remembered that a winding stair outside my room adjoining Denis's led to a small garden. To snatch a breath of fresher air, I began in my dressing gown to descend the stairway, but stopped short at the sound of voices. It was Monsieur Vaignon, talking, I rather guessed, to Fleabart. "No, no," the disturbed half-whisper reached me. "We can't, I tell you. Hélas, it has come again." Hastily but softly I retreated. Monsieur Vaignon's last words had been spoken with a curious emphasis of fear, or of a kind of despairing disgust, and for an instant I regretted not having waited for a sentence or two more. Undecidedly, I regained the landing and saw a crack of light under Denis's door. I gently opened it and entered. "Hello," I said. "So, you can't get to sleep either." "No, it's so hot." He was sitting up in bed, a candle burning in a wall sconce behind him. In some way he seemed apprehensive and excited. "It's not as quiet as you'd suppose out here in the country," I remarked, less from an interest in the fact than to conceal my own continuing agitation. "I thought just now I could hear those old cows moving in the barn, or it may have been the horses in the stables." "Or the ghost," said Denis, "in the tower room." I smiled, as I presumed he expected me to smile. "Oh, does the ghost make noises?" I inquired preoccupiedly, and with my mind still running upon Monsieur Vaignon. "Yes." Denis paused, smiling too, then added oracularly, "Rinking noises. I make it make them." "Rinking noises?" I came out of my brown study, startled somehow, both by this odd description and by a peculiar intonation in his voice. "Like roller skating," he explained. "Ever so funny. He had checked himself abruptly, though the smile lingered on his lips. It was a smile, I had the unpleasant intuition, that saw musingly beyond what I could see, a smile of some superior intimacy and acquaintance, real or fancied. But I considered it wiser not, at this time, to pursue the subject. "Good night," I said presently, and went back to my room. After all this, I had reckoned gloomily on further wakefulness, yet actually fell very soon asleep, arousing with my spirits lightened and refreshed. If it were nothing worse, I remember thinking, than some absurd superstition that was afflicting Monsieur Vaignon, then most of my anxiety was groundless. Merely I was now tired of the business. Just one more visit, possibly, and then this holiday exchange arrangement must begin to die a natural death. However, as we were leaving, I had a mild resurgence of my previous qualms. Monsieur Vaignon's looks were wan, and the hand that shook mine trembled. Suddenly a word to characterize his altered manner, the word I had been seeking unsuccessfully 3 days, flashed disconcertingly into my brain. Guilty. But how preposterous! What had he to feel guilty over? And yet a shadow seemed to darken round me, and round Denis too, as we entered the car, and waved our farewells through its windows. But in the train and on the boat I managed temporarily to redismiss my bothersome forebodings. Perhaps Monsieur Vaignon had privately decided that he had seen enough of us, had resolved gradually to drop us, and yet had found it hard frankly to tell us so. Well, I had felt for my part that the Vaignons latterly were bulking too oppressively and largely on our own Hapgood horizon, and if the break did come eventually from their side rather than from mine, so much the better, and the easier for me. I was in cheerful mood as we returned to Ashtoft. 2 days had passed when the postman delivered to me a registered envelope postmarked Font. The enclosed letter from Monsieur Vaignon read, Dear Colonel Hapgood, it is with infinite distress that I am driven to inform you that it has become advisable for the hitherto so pleasant intimacy between our families to cease. Nor can I am afraid, give any explanation of this deplorable necessity that could satisfy you. I am the victim, it appears, of a fantastic persecution or visitation with which it would not be fair that you should any longer be remotely and even unknowingly associated. This is the most that I am able to tell you in condonation of a gesture that must seem so brutal, but in effect I have to draw a cordon sanitaire around myself, not for my own protection, but for that of those outside it. I can only hope, with my most extreme regrets, that one whom I esteem so highly may accept this fact as it unfortunately stands, and grant me henceforwards the privilege of silence. Yours, V. de la F. Vaignon. I replaced this amazing missive in its envelope. A little while ago I had been meditating just such a development, but not in this style, no indeed. Was the man mad? Oddly, my predominant emotion was not of hurt, or any anger with him. It was rather of bewildered consternation, and even a sort of fear, as if, instead of ending, as it seemed the real trouble were just beginning. Somehow the thing hit me in the face. I did not immediately tell Denis of Monsieur Vaignon's letter, and for over a week I was considering exercised as to how I could best and most wisely do so. Finally, I let him know of it, saying that the Vaignons were going through some kind of private domestic crisis which would probably prevent his staying again at the chateau for some while at least. Admittedly, this was putting a mighty gloss on the affair, yet how else was I to phrase it? Probably, as I had surmised, Monsieur Vaignon had been brooding this step for several months, and failed to muster courage to declare it verbally, but now its absurd written black-and-white announcement was, in all conscience, blunt to crudity, whatever its excursions and whatever the dickens persecution and visitation might be held to mean, and I could hardly show Denis that. He received the news quietly, though I felt it a false and deceptive quiet. It must have been a serious matter to him, and as I see it now, he was inwardly and desperately trying to measure its gravity, and to decide how far this setback might be neutralized or remedied, and still accommodated to his own desires. I was extremely sorry for him, and cast about in my mind for anything that would render the blow less wounding, and leave him a little happier. Oddly, and soon enough, he himself sought to help me out of this difficulty, but in a fashion I by no means relished. I think it'll be Raoul I'll miss most, he said, as if reflectively, yet with a certain patness that did not escape me. I told you about him, didn't I? Raoul? No, you didn't. Didn't I? Not Raoul Privoche? Surely I... No, you never spoke of him. Who is he? Why, he was my greatest friend over there, in a way. I must have told you. We caught moles and bats together and went up to Pi. He's a sort of odd job man, I suppose you'd call him. He gardens and fells trees and looks after horses and... Oh, I know. Denis paused as though struck by sudden inspiration. He could come here. He could work for you. You need someone like that. Oh, if we had Raoul here, I wouldn't mind not going again to the chateau. Nonsense, I answered brusquely. Now, really, how many licenses do you think I'd have to get for importing an article like that from France? What made my tone momentarily bitter had not been the bizarre character of the suggestion, so much as the recognition, in my own boy, of a species of duplicity, for he had never mentioned this Raoul previously, and must have known it. While most emphatically I wanted no more Vaignon echoes of any sort, size, or description, Denis's brows had contracted in a kind of secret defiance. Oh, well, he said glumly, I expect we'll see him here anyhow. I expect he'll turn up, one day, just the same. And the devil of it was, he did. We had finished breakfast, and I was lighting my pipe in the morning room when I heard a light tap at the window. Glancing up, I saw a man outside. He was short and rather shabby, but his face I could not then properly discern. In an instant, heart-sinkingly, I realized who it must be. The fellow was gesturing, and I, in turn, found myself echoing his signals and pointing sidewise towards the front door, which I opened for him. He stood there in the porch, and again with vague nonplussment. I had the incidentally worried feeling that somehow I could not make out his features as plainly as I should. But at that moment there was a scamper of footsteps behind me, and Denis all but flung himself into the figure's arms. "Raoul! Raoul!" he exclaimed ecstatically. "Oh, I knew you'd come!"
"Bonjour, monsieur."
Our visitant had put out a hand, which I mechanically shook. The hand wore a mitten, leaving only the fingers exposed, and in clasping them I experienced a strange repugnance. They were cold and lifeless as a dummy's. But the man could speak, it soon appeared, and volubly. Denis had led him to a back room giving on to the lawn, and there the creature began to chatter, presumably in French of sorts, though too quickly for my comprehension. Denis translated sketchily. Raoul, it seemed, was offering me his services as a general handyman. He had always wanted to live in England, and to have my son for his young master would be bliss indeed. His manner, as he waited while Denis was interpreting, was an odd mixture of deference and sly assurance. "But, good heavens," I protested. "I can't employ him. What about his labor permit? He can't just plant himself on us like this," and the man sat there impassive, his shadowed face averted. Denis was talking with him again, conveying, I supposed, the substance of my objections.
"He's staying here in the village anyhow," Denis announced, "though it would be nicer if he could use our loft over the old coach-house while he was looking around."
"He shall not use our loft," I remember almost sputtering in my dumbfounded indignation. But, in the end, he did. Whether a greater and a prompter firmness on my part would have prevented or, later on, ejected him, I do not know. I believe now that it would not, and, in a sense, that what was had to be. Since Cecile's death, I had denied her child nothing, and if such pampering were weakness, it had at least been hitherto a natural and perhaps pardonable weakness. But my acceptance or toleration of this creature, this object, this ambiguous knot in a board, with whom Denis's infatuation seemed quite inexplicable, was a capitulation to my boy's half-tearful and half-sullen importunities, surpassing any previous indulgence. Be that as it might, Raoul took up his abode in the loft, and thus confronted with the fait accompli, I realized gloomily that it would mean now a lot of unpleasantness and fuss to shift him. So for the time being, and the time being only, as I tried to make it plain, he stayed. There were nearly 3 weeks still to run of Denis's summer holidays, and he spent their waking hours, to my chagrin, almost entirely in his idol's company. I felt bewildered. Why, actually, had the man come here? And had there been a prior secret understanding between him and his admirer in the matter? Was his passport in order? Though I presumed it must be for him to have arrived at all. And what would the neighbors and my own servants think? However, superficially and for a while there was less trouble than I had anticipated. The fellow, to grant him his due, was unobtrusive to the point of self-effacement, and indeed appeared anxious to keep out of people's way. He insisted on some pretense of working for me, and occasionally was to be seen polishing boots and harness, clearing dead wood from the shrubbery and the like. His meals he ate usually apart, fetching them from the kitchen, and consuming them in his loft. How he got on with my cook, Jenny, or with my maid, Clara, I was at first unable to find out. Probably they decided that the curious importation represented merely one more whim of the young master's, and for the present let it go at that. As for my regular groom and gardener Dobbs, he, as it happened, was in hospital, so his reactions were not yet available. Just the same, the position was bizarre. Denis would shortly be returning to school, and then, of course, there could be no excuse for Raoul's remaining. I half thought once or twice, and despite the silence so mysteriously enjoined on me of writing to sound Monsieur Vaignon on the subject, but, as may be imagined, I was pretty much on my dignity in that quarter, and had, besides, no right whatever to assume that he was implicated or involved in any way with Raoul. I was on the edge and out of sorts, living, it seemed, unreally, in a kind of semi-dream. More and more I became sensible of this man Raoul's presence, irking me in a manner I could not describe. And one small item in particular still teased me. The fellow had been here, now close on 2 weeks, and yet for some reason I had never formed a clear idea of his appearance. Either his features struck me differently at different times, or had a queer, indefiniteness that amounted, as it were, to nullity. It was not till later that I discovered that this little difficulty of his facelessness had bothered other people too. One day, less than a week before the end of his holidays, Denis had started a slight cold. It seemed nothing much, and hadn't stopped his going out all morning, as was now his rule, with his obnoxious playmate on the down, but was enough in view of the nearness of his return to school to worry me. I remember telling him to take it easy indoors for the rest of the afternoon, and then retiring myself to my study with the intention, I also recall, of settling finally my future course of action in this whole exasperating affaire Raoul. But my deliberations had not got very far when they were interrupted by a visit from a Mr. Wallstron, a local farmer to whom I was arranging to lease a meadow. Terms having been agreed to mutual satisfaction, the old man went on to gossip amiably of other things. "Your boy misses his mother, surely. Up there on the Winnaker I met him this morning, looking right poorly, and chattering away like that, all to himself." To himself? Why, I faltered, confused and apprehensive. "Well, yes, talking, or it might have been singing, you know, and funny thing, my 2 dogs, oh, you should have seen 'em. Such a snarling and a snapping. Never seen 'em act that way with your young lad before." Presently Mr. Wallstron wished me a good day, leaving me, certainly, with plenty to think over. It was extremely strange. Denis, I knew, had gone out, not alone, but with Raoul. And then those dogs. For, oddly, it had been with dogs that Raoul had achieved as yet his summit of unpopularity. My own setter, Trixie, could not abide him, shivering and growling quite dementedly whenever he was by, and evidently undecided whether to fly from or at him. I was still trying to digest the implications of Mr. Wallstron's story when the form of Raoul himself darkened the panes. Outwardly and otherwise well conducted, he had an annoying habit of coming round to the windows and tapping to attract attention. This time, perceiving I had already observed him, he did not tap, but simply held up a hand. To my disgusted consternation, I saw that the wrist and forearm were bloody. Hurrying out, I examined his hurt. The flesh was badly lacerated. "Chien," I understood him to mutter. "Chien." Here was a further complication. Dog bites can be mischievous, and I would not risk attempting to treat such wounds myself. So far, I had shirked bringing the man's residence to any official or even semi-official cognizance. But now, if the doctor was called, my precious piece of contraband must be declared, and I foresaw all sorts of tiresome queries as to the fellow's position under the Health Insurance Act and the amount of stupid fuss. In the event, I summoned my old friend and adviser, Goderic, who had attended Cecile during her last illness. He dressed Raoul's arm, and, while on the spot, looked at my boy as well. Denis's cold had gotten worse. He was running a temperature, and Goderic promised to come again next day. Reports then on the 2 patients were discouraging. As for Raoul, he had had to be moved to a small attic bedroom. His wound was an ugly one, and I somehow gathered an impression that Goderic was puzzled by the case. Denis, it seemed probable, would not be fit to return punctually to school, and for a time I half suspected him of shamming in order to postpone the parting with his friend. He, Denis, had been told of Raoul's misadventure, and pleaded vainly to be allowed to see him. The pair were upon different floors and in different wings. The farther from each other, I had thought, the better. Raoul's accident, and he could or would not state which dog or dogs it was that had attacked him, had been upon a Thursday, and by the Sunday his arm still showed no improvement. The following morning, Goderic rather surprised me by asking to see for myself, and I watched him unwrap the bandages. I caught, I fancied, an expression of something approaching astonishment on his face when the torn flesh was bared. The entire limb below the elbow was swollen, and had a repulsive, livid hue. Goderic motioned me to go. "I'll see you afterwards," he murmured. "Well," he said, rejoining me downstairs, "I'll confess I'm a bit foxed. The latest wonder drugs proved a flop, and it's quite extraordinary. But the whole forearm seems—" "Yes, what?" I pressed impatiently. "Why, to have mortified. But it couldn't have, to that extent, without other associated symptoms, gross symptoms, which just aren't there. Yet, well, pah! Well, the damn thing almost stinks." I stared at him, and he went on. I'm speaking unprofessionally, Hapgood, and not merely being nosy. Precisely how you came by this odd customer I'm not inquiring, but... Our talk was interrupted by a scurrying commotion in the passage. The door burst open, and Clara entered with scarcely a preliminary knock.
"Oh, excuse me, sir, but Master Denis..."
Behind her at that instant Denis himself appeared, tearfully distraught. "What is it?" I said, pushing Clara aside and catching him up in my arms. "What's happened?" But for a while, after I had carried him back to bed, he refused to tell us. It was only at first from Clara that we discovered that Raoul must have stealthily crept from his room, traversed the intervening corridors, and visited the boy. Clara had heard a cry from within the bedroom, and seen Raoul emerging just as she arrived upon the scene. Furious, I was starting off there, and then for Raoul's attic, but Goderic restrained me. "Let me," he said. "I'll go." He was away a long time, and when he returned, his words further amazed me. "Well, I give up. I'm not a doctor. Doctors don't see such things. Call me a bald-headed Belgian and be done with it. I give it up." "What do you mean?" "Why, when I got there, the fellow was smiling. By the way, has he a face to smile with? I'm never sure. Was sort of smiling and holding out his arm and saying, 'Gary, Gary,' like a Cheshire cat, if they do. I'm a bit overcome." "You mean..." "I mean that it was cured. Is cured. A little swelling, and he's a normal slight fever. Here, give me a tot of your Glenlivet. I tell you I give up." This episode, itself grotesque, marked the beginning of a fresh, more ominous phase in my relationship with Raoul, and brought into my mind's open a host of doubts. And until then, but dimly realized fears. Just as the startled eye may all at once perceive the latent shapes of horror in the far, nobly drifting clouds and summer leaves, or as the meek familiar pattern of a wallpaper may spring into a sudden tracery of hell, so now the course of these events revealed a darker trend. The unaccountable affair of Raoul's arm had left me quite uncertain what to believe or disbelieve, or what might happen next. Circumstances had forced me to admit Goderic to my confidence, yet for a while we each fought shy of a direct discussion. What had occurred was so fantastically out of line with ordinary experience that we had, I suppose, to try somehow to deny and to discredit it a little even to ourselves. Raoul made a complete recovery, and my determination to evict him was renewed. Denis, however, remained by no means well, and I still shrank from distressing him. As if guessing what I meditated, he had grown louder than usual in his companion's praises.
"You don't like him,"
he accused reproachfully, yet with a suppressed tight smile that had about it, how shall I express it, a sort of odd, repugnant coyness. I just don't see anything much in him. He can't stay here forever."
"Why? What harm does he do? I wish you'd liked him."
I did not answer, and we turned presently to other topics, but I continued baffled and, in some deeper sense, dismayed. It might be, as Denis said, that Raoul appeared to do no active harm. But it was this very negativity that partly was the trouble, and made his evident attraction for my boy so utterly incomprehensible. The fellow, in his coarse laborer's clothes and ridiculous mittens, was an incongruity and an excrescence on the English countryside, and yet his most outstanding characteristic, to be paradoxical, was his characterlessness. He seemed as sinisterly unresponsive and empty of emotion as a robot. The date when Denis should have returned to school was past. He had got better, then had a relapse, developing a variety of low undulant fever. An X-ray of his chest reassured me as to the state of his lungs, but the symptoms did not abate. I was disappointed also in finding it now the harder to give Raoul his congé, and I could not but connect the two things in my mind. Raoul, I was certain, was somehow the cause of Denis's poor appetite, his wan and wasted look, and alternating fits of nervous stimulation and depression. Denis slept in a room close to mine, and once or twice I fancied I heard noises of bumping and what I could then only describe as a kind of dull, sustained metallic humming coming from it. A dark suspicion visited me. Could Raoul be there? But on softly opening the door, I found Denis alone and apparently asleep. The noises, if there had been any, had entirely ceased. However, and recalling the anomaly, or prodigy, of the instantaneously healed arm, I remained still convinced that Raoul must be ultimately their author. This instinct or persuasion that Raoul was the source of some pernicious influence destructive of my boy gained steady strength. Denis's manner to me had changed, and his constant terror that I should part him from his strange playmate was obvious, while more specifically the noises I had heard were noises. I would swear it. They increased towards midnight, but for a time, whenever I approached, died down. Goderic, up to a point, did what he could, but was, I felt, as well aware as I that tonics and cough mixtures did not touch the matter's root. At last, after I had told him of the odd sounds, he remarked mildly, "If I were you, Hapgood, I would consider getting rid of that chap Raoul, you know. I really would." The restraint of this recommendation was almost comical, but I did not smile. "Do you know anything about him? I was just wondering if, by any chance, he had ever had anything to do with your wife's family. Worked for them once, maybe, and used that as an introduction to you. I'm only guessing." "Oh, no," I replied confidently enough. "Denis chummed up with the beauty in the Vaignon's village in Auvergne, that's all." "These noises, is there ever anything broken or disarranged as well after you hear them?" "No, Wait a bit, though." Yes, I remembered. I had found a vase smashed once, and more than once had noticed drawers pulled out, and a general air of untidiness or confusion. I told Goderic so. "Well, pass the word if that sort of thing hosts up. And seriously, I should give that chap the boot. It'll upset the lad, but I should risk it." When Goderic had gone, I pondered his indubitably sound advice, lugubriously. I could readily guess what had been at the back of his mind in asking, as to the noises, whether anything had been broken or moved about, yet the notion of poltergeist activities, while certainly sufficiently unpleasant, did not appear entirely to fit the case. They might, for all I knew, be present, but even so would fall short of providing a complete explanation. For possibly the 100th time, I vowed that Raoul must go, and indeed, quite apart from my own resolutions, matters were coming to a head. The commotions in Denis's room increased, being heard now by the servants, and were at last admitted by Denis himself. He denied all responsibility for them, in which I fully believed him, but did not seem afraid of or disturbed by them. "But don't they wake you up and spoil your rest?"
"Oh, sometimes, but I don't care. I go to sleep again."
He looked restive under my interrogation. Nowadays he was dressed and intermittently able to stroll out of doors if it were sunny, but spent much of his time in a chaise lounge, either in his room or laterally with Raoul on a glass-roofed veranda. The pair would sit there, conversing softly, the man whittling sticks, which he would fashion into a variety of uncouth doll, and my boy watching him fascinatedly, as if the world's fate hung upon these operations. Denis glanced up at me appealingly.
"Promise me something."
"What?" But I guessed what it would be.
That you won't send Raoul away."
"Well, as I've said already, he can't stay forever. Why do you think I shouldn't send him away?" Denis's eyes, wide in some secret conjuring of disaster, met mine squarely.
"It would kill me,"
he said simply. As well as I might, although I felt evasively and with some sacrifice of honesty, I pacified him and then left him. What could I do? Denis, of course, had been exaggerating and distraught, but such words from a child. Of late he had grown appreciably thinner, and I had only to contrast these waxen cheeks and pallid lips with his comparatively vigorous appearance a short month ago to realize the alarming swiftness of the change. To say I could not prove this due to Raoul was idle. It was from Raoul's arrival that the symptoms dated, and it was from him, I was certain, that they sprang. This lay figure, this fantoche, this hollow puppet, was the unhallowed instrument of a vile infestation that had assaulted Denis's whole physical and moral organism. Watching the two together, as I was often able from a window overlooking the veranda, I would be driven into a kind of agony of speculation as to the nature of the bond between them. My boy's face, raptly brooding or wearing that charmed smile I loathed even more, was usually averted, but I caught on it sometimes an enthralled abandon or absorption that would chill my blood. The creature Raoul, meanwhile, in his adorer's presence, would seem reanimated, made less neuter and less negative, as if his very being were enhanced and, how to put it, as if it were at Denis's expense. By Denis's depletion of vitality, that he existed, or that his actuality was heightened, as if, as the one waxed, the other shrank and waned. Scarcely troubling to hide my agitation as such ideas possessed me, I had tried once or twice to break in upon the pair in these ambiguous intimacies, but I soon recognized to no avail. The two would fall momentarily silent, Denis looking half guilty and half angry. Then, as I knew, the instant that my back was turned, their curious tete-a-tete would recommence. Nevertheless, despite its accumulating worry and distraction, my life had still preserved a surface ordinariness and normality. Friends would occasionally drop in on me, or I on them as heretofore, and I do not think now that they noticed much amiss. To be sure, they commented upon Denis's exhausted, drooping air, and sympathized with my anxiety about him, but they can have seen little of Raoul, and probably the gossip I had tended to imagine rife was confined chiefly to my own household. There must have been some. Clara and old Jenny, even while not appreciating its significance, could not be blind and deaf to a good deal of what was happening under their noses, and their refusal to spread tales or fuss was testimony to their loyalty and long-suffering discretion. As for Raoul's outward or official status, this had been regularized with less ado than I expected. A week or so after his arrival, on the insistence, as I learned surprisingly of Denis, he had gone into Winchester, and Denis, acting as interpreter, registered at the police station as an alien. What did he put himself down as? I'd asked disturbedly. Not as my employee, I hope? And,
"Oh no," Denis reassured me. "Just as a visitor, just as your guest."
That sounded well enough, and I grudgingly had to give Denis credit for his enterprise, but to confirm it I went in myself next day to Winchester. Yes, everything I was told was quite in order. Oh yes, perfectly. I would have been interested to see the passport, which must have been produced by Raoul, but had not pressed the matter. I was recalling this piece of compliance with legalities, comfortingly factual and satisfactory seeming so far as it went, to Goderic. He mused dubiously. The blighter's an infernal incubus, whatever else he is or ain't, and I wish you could just show him the door. As I've confessed, I'm a finger or so out of my depth. The case is fair game, I fancied, for a psychical researching bloke, or a psychiatrist. You're prejudiced, I realize, against them, and I'm not insisting, but I'm worried about you, as well as Denis. I'll have 2 patients here instead of 1 directly. It was true that the business was wrecking me. Each day I felt that I could stand no more, and that to end it I should be driven to some act of violence. When I eventually was so driven, it appeared for a short time almost a relief. The situation had continued to deteriorate. Denis, after a session with his deer, would wear an aspect veritably of the grave, and the idea which had been shaping in my mind before besieged me now with an increasing force. He is losing something, giving something, I thought. But he would not want to do that, do it deliberately, more or less voluntarily for nothing. He must get something, be tempted by something in return. But what? What? I lived in a waking nightmare, and the idea's hold on me grew stronger. That Denis's delicately nurtured boyhood should fall prey to the appetites of an amorphous doll and become the meat of this uncanny zany seemed of all things the most abominable. The details and precise technique of such infernal commerce were beyond my fathoming, but that the ghastly trade existed, and that Denis was its dedicated victim, I felt positive. Who was this Raoul? When he had first arrived, I had attempted, if simply in grudging common courtesy, to engage him in conversation, but his thick, overwrought dialect, as I presumed it, had defeated me, and nowadays I did not try to talk with him. As I watched him through the window, whittling his sticks and looking rather like a well-fed scarecrow, a speechless rage possessed me. Was the man knave or loon? For hours on end, Complacently, yet dully, and only his hands moving, he would squat there with the bland corpulence and mindless sedentary persistence of some gigantic blowfly, and my own hands would writhe in fury. If I could catch him at it, I thought chokingly. If I could catch him at it, I would strangle him. If I could catch him. Yes, I had emotionally a very vague and general notion or suspicion of what might be going on, but that was all. While, as for evidence, if this dumb gangrened oaf were a variety of psychic leech, as I surmised, able to tap and suck away my boy's vitality, his health and spiritual stamina, how was it done? It was probably, I realized, a vain, or at least not ordinarily answerable question, yet the business, I argued, must have some sort of rationale, some sort of place and time. During a good part of the day, the pair were under, or liable if I chose to come under, my observation, and I hardly believed that Denis received his consort in his bedroom, or vice versa. Laterally, Raoul had returned to his old sleeping quarters in the loft, and in any case I had taken, I considered, adequate precautions against a nocturnal meeting. It was, however, then, between dusk and midnight, that the noises and other disturbances were most troublesome. And this, too, I reflected, fitted in with my theory to some extent. Poltergeists, I had heard, were regarded as the prankish play of a surplus vital force or energy, and it was just after this force's flow, from Denis, had been stimulated but yet deprived temporarily of its accustomed receptacle in Raoul, that the impish manifestations centering around my boy were commonest. As to the poltergeists themselves, if poltergeists they were, I was not primarily concerned about or bothered by them, and it was commentary enough upon the situation, as I saw it, that such a matter should be reckoned a mere minor and subsidiary nuisance. Could it be only, how long, barely 5 weeks today since Raoul appeared? At this time my nights were as a rule dark stretches of tormented wakefulness, and when, not often till towards early morning, I did fall asleep, my rest would usually be broken and haunted by appalling dreams. One of these I especially remember. I was in France, and Cecile was still with me. She had been recounting, it seemed, a legend of her native province, and, with an unexplained urgency, was directing my attention to a particular passage in a book. We were both standing by a wide window, and the diabolically piled Silurian landscape of Auvergne stretched from us for many leagues under a breathless summer heat. But the odd thing was that Cecile was holding the book up in front of her face, and expecting me to read it through its covers, and all the intervening pages. This, in some miraculous manner, I was able in my dream to do, though with difficulty and a sense of growing apprehension and oppression. Of one sentence, which she was extraordinarily anxious I should read, I could make out 4 words only. "Shall feast upon thee." I was on the point, I thought, of deciphering the rest when suddenly the book slipped from my wife's hands, revealing not her face, but empty air. With a cry of terror, I awoke. The dream was only a dream, and probably just before I fell asleep my mind had again been running on Godric's query once as to a possible connection between Raoul and Cecile's family, yet its tense, loaded flavor clung to me, and had the quality somehow of a presentiment. I felt I had no need to ask of what. For a good while now I had been scarcely capable of keeping up the pretense of normal living, and a crisis would not be long delayed. If I could catch him at it, I found myself always repeating, if I could catch him. And then one day I did. It was an afternoon in October, and Denis had been sitting with his inseparable companion on the sun porch. Occasionally he would desist from his talking and take up a book. It was a child's book from the shelves of his old nursery, and I was mildly surprised that he should still be interested in what I thought he had outgrown. The veranda, as I have said, was glass-topped, and there was a glass-paned windbreak at one end, too. Branches of a wistaria tree at the side had been persuaded to straggle irregularly over part of the roof, and there were pots of hydrangeas along the front. The blooms now were past their best, but the place retained a faded greenness, and a, to me, pleasantly shabby, half-neglected air, which I should have been sorry to see give way to greater trimness. A window, as I have also said, commanded a restricted view of this semi-enclosed space. And it was through this window, the high French window of a small spare parlor, that I had often, with an uneasiness that had mounted as the weeks dragged by, to anguish, watched my boy and his companion. Yet, what was the good of that? I asked myself. They must realize by this my bursting suspicions and antagonism, and to them my harrowed glances would be merely spying. Denis was alienated from me, from his own father, and there was nothing I could do. On this afternoon I quickly abandoned such entirely fruitless surveillance. I must find something to occupy my thoughts and hands, or else go mad. I had remembered a broken fence by the apple orchard that needed mending, but having collected hammer and nails, I had scarcely started on my job before a fearful premonition of disaster gathered in my brain. I was aware, as if by a direct insight, of something enormously, incredibly evil. I must go back. This recognition of sheer calamity was so overpowering that I instantly dropped my tools and actually started running towards the house. However, an instinct of discretion slowed my steps, and I approached more cautiously. I could not where I was be seen from the veranda, but to make doubly sure, I took a devious route around a hedge of macrocarpa. Mingled with my apprehension was a swelling rage. How could I have been so blind, I remember thinking, to what was going on under my nose? For that was what it had amounted to. Why had I fancied that this infernal traffic necessarily required a set rendezvous or any physical propinquity? I will strangle myself, I heard myself saying. He deserves it, and I shall do it. It was as if my fingers were upon the creature's neck, as if time were foreshortened, or in some fashion telescoped, as if what was to happen had already happened and I was already there. The October day was waning as, very quietly, I re-entered the parlor, tiptoed across the room, and looked. Raoul, from where I stood, was invisible, but I could see Denis plainly, still sitting as I had left him, in a battered old wicker chair, reading his book. Or rather, he was not so much sitting as crouching, hunched forward in an odd stiff posture on the edge of the chair seat. A last shaft of reddening light drew frail fire from his blond hair, but his face was hidden by the book. An intimation of horror and of an unnameable corruption filled my heart. Something in Denis's queer, locked attitude and his whole appearance utterly dismayed and sickened me. Hardly breathing, I stole nearer. My movement was very soft, but Denis must have caught or have divined it, for he started violently. The book slipped from his hands. Upon his suddenly revealed face was an expression I will not describe. It was open before me like a dreadful flower. Evil, we know, exacts its dues of ruin from the tenderest transgressors. But the reverse side of the matter is less willingly admitted and more shocking. And now the swift unveiling for me of sin's fleeting wage to my unhappy boy was beyond words appalling. I would, if I could, have shut my eyes on what I had surprised. Denis's features, fixed in their long enchantment, wore a look that was a travesty of boyhood and a blasphemy of all my memories of him. The face in its ecstasy was laced and hemmed and old with an oldness that had nothing to do with years. Watching him, while the running sands of his being received their frightful recompense, I too was a prisoner to an unreal eternity, though in my case of anguish. Then, instantaneously the spell was broken, as Denis gave a low, despairing cry. I flung apart the French windows and dashed out onto the veranda. Where was Raoul? Denis, I must subconsciously have told myself, would recover presently from his half-swoon, and my first business was with his despoiler. Had the thing vanished? Not altogether. Below the veranda, in the glimpse of the shrubbery, I indistinctly glimpsed it, already in lumbering flight. I caught it up beside the hedge of macrocarpa, making for the coach-house. The figure, shadowy in the fading light, had turned at my approach, and in an odd, ineffective way put up a fumbling arm to keep me off. My hands closed round its throat, and for a while we struggled, swaying. Some seconds passed, and as yet the loathsome ninny had remained quite silent, but all at once I heard a little noise.
It is said that certain creatures, ordinarily voiceless, may, in extremity, find feeble tongue, that, in the agony of boiling, wretched lobsters compass a last faint, unexampled squeak. And it was now of such a puny cry that I was put in mind. The sound filled me with revulsion. My fingers pressed more strongly. Raoul, as we grappled, was being forced slowly backwards towards a tree trunk, against which it was my idea to pin him, and either he had managed to trip me or I had slipped and stumbled. The two of us crashed heavily, I uppermost. For some seconds longer I was still aware of him beneath me, writhing and battling, yet somehow eluding me. But the next moment he had gone. Dazedly I picked myself up and gazed round me in search of the thing that had melted into vacancy from my grasp. And there was no sign of it, anywhere at all. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Feasting Dead by John Metcalfe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 2. There were black days that followed. I cannot convey how black. Though with the exit of Denis's sinister playfellow the worst seemed over, I felt in my heart chilly that this was only an uneasy breathing space, and that the story yet was far from done. Breathing space? No, it was not really even that. Raoul, I hoped, was banished, but his work remained. Denis was ill, staring at me with horror and aversion, as if I were the sole author of his misery. He could scarcely bear that I should speak to him or go near his bed. The loss I recognized with anguish of his frightful parasite and paramour had virtually prostrated him, and he had ceased to be the boy Cecile and I had loved. As to the eerie lummox who had plagued us, I concluded that he had succeeded somehow in wriggling free from me and fleeing, that he would probably make his way back to France, and that, at least in person, if he were a person, he would trouble us no more. Or rather, this was what I tried to tell myself, I had concluded. Truth is not necessarily or always sober, and there was something here, I realized inwardly, of which all ordinary sane explanations and conjectures failed to take account. Denis, when I had re-entered the house after Raoul's flight, had been in a half-faint. The servants, roused by my running footsteps along the veranda, had found him lying by the chair and carried him to his room. Reviving, he had set up a low, continuous moaning, which did not abate till Goderic, whom I had at once rung up, had given him a sedative. That had secured him a night's sleep. But next day, as I have said, he would hardly suffer my approach, and once had even barricaded his door against me. I was at my wit's end, and terrified lest he should do himself an injury. Goderic shared my anxiety. "Have you discovered any more about this unholy creature now he's gone?" he asked. "Any more? Why, how?" "I mean that now he has gone, tongues might wag a bit more freely. Your servants, for instance." "Oh, yes," I agreed. "Yes, plenty of that." It was a fact that Jenny and Clara had unbosomed themselves to me of a good deal as to Raoul and their sentiments towards him, which they had hitherto repressed, though without adding materially to my actual information. I told Goderic so. "How did you explain the fellow's sudden disappearance to them?" "I didn't, in any detail. They must have guessed that I chased him off. I don't think they cared how he went, as long as he went." "Well, honestly, I feel I can't do much. I wish you would try a psychiatrist." But I was not ready for that, yet. And was there, possibly, an ever so slightly hurt or reproachful tone in my friend's voice? If so, it must have been because he could divine that with him, too, in my description of the final scene, I had been reticent of what I had called details. Denis recovered to the extent of leaving his bed and room and occasionally loitering alone about the orchard and meadow, but we were strangers to each other. My acquaintance, or partial acquaintance, with his dreadful secret made me a terror to him, and there seemed something pathetically horrible in the evident efforts of this child to wrest the situation to his own partisan, extenuating view of it, to digest, modify, or soften it, so as to render it more tolerable to him, and to me, not Raoul, as his enemy. It could not, I would think, go on like this. How, if I lived to be 100, could I forget, or he
forget that I must still remember. I would remind him always. As he grew up, if not already, in a shame so poignantly embarrassed, he would wish my death. Thus, for a week or so, matters continued. My uncertainty as to what had really happened to Raoul prevented my finding much consolation, even in his absence, and soon after his disappearance I had a visit from the Winchester City Police. Visage, they said, at first I barely recalled the fellow's surname, had failed to report at the expiration of 1 month's residence, and was he with me still? I could only reply with a modicum of truth that he had run off suddenly, I had no notion where. Run off? Yes, I explained that the defaulter was a friend of my boy's of whom I had practically no knowledge, and I could see that my worthy, and to me very respectful, constable was dissatisfied and puzzled. "He should have checked out properly," he grumbled. "If he went back to France, now, there'd be trouble and an itch, you see, of some kind at the port." Meanwhile, the improvement in Denis's condition had been at least superficially maintained. That was, he looked a shade less pale and had a better appetite. The nightly thumpings, hummings, and a new ingredient, derisive hootings, had, however, increased, the racket finally attaining such proportions that, out of consideration for my domestic's rest, I had his bedroom changed to one as far from theirs as possible. To me, his manner remained stubbornly hostile. I had pleadingly attempted to get him to speak openly, frankly, and give me his own version of affairs, but quite in vain. It seemed but too apparent that he had suffered a veritable bereavement, and was still pining for his vanished mate. Reluctantly, I was beginning to resign myself to taking Godric's advice and trying a psychiatrist. This course would pretty evidently expose me, as well as the patient proper, to a good deal of awkwardness and incredulous, silly catechizings, but I must shirk no measure that might restore my boy. The leaves were falling and the October days growing colder when I happened to receive a note reminding me of the approaching anniversary dinner of my old regiment. I'd never missed attending it, and the formal invitation card was enclosed. But now I had no heart to go, and besides, it would be out of the question. On the other hand, it was from Winchester, barely 6 miles away, that Mayfield, who had been my adjutant and was organizing the affair this year, had written me. He chanced, he told me, to be spending the inside of a week there on business, and he was probably expecting, I surmised, that I should ask him to stay with me instead of at his hotel, at any rate for Saturday and Sunday. This, too, as matters were, was scarcely practicable, but the least I could do, I thought, was to run over to Winchester and see him. I decided to risk leaving Denis in Jenny's and Clara's care, and drove off after lunch. My chat with Mayfield, to whom I explained the position so far as necessary, was as pleasant as anything could be in my state of worry about Denis, but I hurried home from it so as to arrive by tea-time. Clara and Jenny, to my dismay, were both waiting for me at the porch, and their words, as I jumped out of the car, told me the worst. Denis had gone. Self-reproach was as useless as unavoidable. I had to act. "When did you miss him?" I asked. It had been only 20 minutes ago. He had been on the veranda, and then, no longer seeing him there and wishing to reassure themselves, they had looked for him. His room was empty and fairly tidy, but a small suitcase was undiscoverable, likewise some socks and a shirt. The most conclusive piece of evidence, however, which seemed to rule out hope that he had merely set off for a walk and might return, was the fact that Jenny's room also had been entered, and her money stolen. "How much?"
£4.10, sir. I had it in a little china box and was going to bank it Tuesday."
Expecting me at any moment, they had not as yet given an alarm to the police, and I decided rather than telephone to drive back again myself to Winchester. Meanwhile, Jenny could ring me at the police station if my poor truant did, after all, return. The desk sergeant knew me well and listened attentively to my story. "It's early yet," he encouraged, "and he may be just larking, but of course we'll notify it and alert other stations round about. 5:15 now. He can't be very far." "And watch the ports, too," I reminded him. My first thought naturally had been of Raoul, and my first fear that Denis was rejoining him. "Oh, yes, we'll do that as routine, although he couldn't get across, without a passport." As to that, I had privately my doubts. Given sufficient determination, there were ways of doing it, as a recent instance happened to have shown. After a further consultation, this time with the local superintendent in his adjoining sanctum, I drove home. "No news, I suppose, Jenny?"
"No, sir."
With what fortitude we could, we resigned ourselves, as remorseful, empty hours passed, to the wretched, and in my case almost sleepless, night. Feeling that the emergency had more than justified my breaking any rule of silence, I sent a wire of inquiry to Monsieur Vaignon. An answer arrived fairly promptly, not here yet. This left me more up in the air than ever, and in vain did I strive to supply, as it were, the real and untelegraphable intonation of that word yet. It sounded as if Monsieur Vaignon rather expected that Denis might come later, but I could not be sure. I returned to the question of the passport. Denis had a passport, an individual one, to allow of his escort sometimes by Flebert and sometimes by myself, but I had locked it up after his last trip and had it locked up still. In any case, I thought he must have realized that, before he could possibly reach the coast, the dock police would have been warned so that the document would be useless to him. The Winchester district, I was told, had been combed thoroughly without result, and as time passed it surprised me that a boy could elude the police net for so long. It argued, certainly, either a degree of ineptitude on the one side, or considerable adroitness and resource upon the other. Perhaps whatever official incredulity might say, Denis had succeeded by walking only at night and spending each day up a tree, in a manner I had read of, and striking a place where French fishing boats put in, and then bribed some sailor into smuggling him across. This notion was, if anything, strengthened by a discovery made by Clara when the hunt was 6 days old. She ran excitedly to me in my study one morning, crying,
"Oh, we found something!"
It transpired that in cleaning out the loft she had come upon 2 loaves, 2 tins of sardines and a can opener, a jar of marmalade, and the suitcase, which was empty, a veritable cache. These objects, which I went with her to inspect, had been hidden under sacking near a back door giving on to a short outer stair by which access could be gained to the loft without first passing through the coach-house below. Close by, I noticed with aversion, was a collection of the grotesque wooden dolls, something like 9-pins, which Raoul had been used to whittle. And most significantly, an empty open tin and scattered crumbs showed that one meal at least had been consumed up there already. However illogically, this find, and particularly the abandoned suitcase, established as an emotional certainty in my mind the belief that Denis had managed to reach France, or was upon his way there. He had been clever enough, I told myself, to lie hidden in the immediate vicinity while the search was most intensive, and then to slip off by night as I had supposed. Yes, that was it. That must be it. I came to a prompt decision. That very afternoon, having rung Goderic to tell him what I contemplated, I set off for Southampton, calling in at the Winchester police station en route. I could see that my plan to pursue, they would not admit that it was that, my boy to France had met with official skepticism and disfavor. But though I did concur in the suggestion that a watch would be set, if all too tardily, around the loft, I would not allow the cold water thrown on it to weaken my resolve. And as it happened, while I was not to know it then, I had only, as it were, anticipated matters by a single night. A second wire from Monsieur Vaignon, I had learned later, Denis here, arrived for me the morning after I had left. One morning, the prosaic and accustomed train, my gently having bunk upon the almost as accustomed Channel packet in the familiar harbor of Le Havre at misty dawn. The same, yes, all the same, and yet how different. Many times had I made this crossing, but with a heart unracked, as now by care. Eating my petit déjeuner in the station buffet when I had passed through the customs, I bought a newspaper and further supply of brioches, and again boarded the train. Paris and lunch, then southwards. On to what? As we began to breast the gradual ascent towards the Massif, a vague but dreadful apprehension grew upon me. I dashed off from England, I realized, largely because inaction had become intolerable, yet here in France I quailed. It was as if, while I approached that black and tortured landscape of Auvergne, I were adventuring foolhardily into some citadel of evil powers, pitting my puny strength against a host of devils. I took up my newspaper and tried to read. In vain. Denis, I thought, where are you? What are you doing now, and why? With an effort, I forced myself to re-examine as critically and calmly as I might the chain of circumstances that had led to my being where I was, and upon such a quest. Vaignon and Raoul. The whole business of the holiday exchanges had been so casual, so benign, and yet, yes, there must be some connection, beyond mere coincidence, between the two. I recalled Monsieur Vaignon's brooding and half-guilty looks, and that peculiar scrap of conversation I had overheard. "It had come again," he had said then to Flaubert. What had come again? Could it... Suddenly my mind snapped on something, and deliberately for a second I made it blank, as if afraid of the light that threatened all at once to flood it. I even grabbed my paper and feigned a furious engrossment in its long columns of advertisements. Next morning, however, I gave up the pretense, and a sigh escaped me, a sort of cold sigh of recognition and admission. Could it? Why, yes, of course it could. The "it" of Monsieur Vaignon's terrified lament was Raoul. How this lurking, while fairly obvious conjecture had managed to get itself hushed up in the recesses of my brain, as I'm sure it had, for such a time before issuing forth at last to startle me, I did not know. But I found it now a highly disturbing one. Without as yet being able to appreciate all its implications, I felt dimly a kind of spreading illumination, as though the contours of some formidable truth would presently emerge. To reach Fouant, I had directly to change to a slower train with a number of stops. The countryside remained, on the whole, placidly pastoral, but I fancied I began to detect in it, here and there, faint earnests or intimations of that sinister quality which the Auvergne, whither I travelled, had always held for me. Monsieur Vaignon would be prepared for my coming, since I had telegraphed him from Le Havre. But what sort of welcome he would accord me, I had no idea. I had not, it must be remembered, received the wire from him that would arrive at Ashtoft the next morning, and I had nothing at the moment but my impulsive intuition to lead me to suppose Denis at the chateau. The sun was westering as we slackened speed for Fouant, and before that, of course, the scenery had assumed the intimidating gigantism and cataclysmic look of violence which every time I visited the place had sent a shiver up my spine. Alighting, I stared round me, but could see no one, on my own island platform or on either of the other two, except the ticket collector and a couple of peasant women. Perhaps Monsieur Vaignon was so indignant at my flat defiance of his previous virtual prohibition that he was not sending anyone to meet me. Owing to his strange imposition of silence, I had felt unable to write to him, or question him maybe concerning Raoul, and though I now suspected him of knowing more about it than he might confess, his official state was one of ignorance, and he might not appreciate the seriousness of the case. For a quarter of an hour I waited impatiently in the little salle d'attente. Had Monsieur Vaignon actually resolved to deny me his hospitality? But no, he had answered my first wire. And surely, in common humanity, he couldn't be sure a bear, and such a brute. I was, however, on the point either of telephoning the chateau, or, without doing so, of hiring, if I could, a taxi, when a car hurtled furiously into the station yard. It hurtled in so furiously that I experienced a curious start of anticlimax at the sight of the form that crawled feebly out of the driving seat. The figure advanced immediately with a sort of frenzied, impetuous hobble towards me. Yes, it was Monsieur Vaignon. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Feasting Dead by John Metcalfe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 3. Question and answer between us tumbled over each other, standing on no ceremony of greeting. "Is he with you?" "Yes, but you could not have my telegram so soon." "Is he all right?" You will see." We got into the car. "Flaubert," Monsieur Vaignon explained interjectorily, "has left, and it is I who am chauffeur. I fear I am late." I mumbled something to which he paid no attention. We had shot out of the station yard into the gathering dusk of the highway, Monsieur Vaignon still driving like a maniac. His manner notwithstanding had a kind of distrait debonair moroseness, and the conditions generally as we careened wildly onwards were unfavorable to conversation. Yet I did once attempt it. "Denis has been terribly ill," I said. "He is not himself, or he would not have run away, and I would not have had to trouble you. How does he seem now?" Monsieur Vaignon's nearer shoulder gave me an absent shrug. "I cannot tell you. We are all bedeviled.
n'est-ce pas? And the evil days are on us. They are on your boy, who does not know you're here, but won't, I bet you, let you talk to him, or get within 10 feet of him." My heart sank, but despair goaded me to a flare of anger, too. "We shall see about that," I said. The chateau, when we entered it at nightfall, was a place of dark, uneasy stillness. A man whose face was unfamiliar had admitted us, and he immediately retreated again from us. "Where is Denis?" I asked Monsieur Vaignon. "Where is he?" We had passed from the hall into a small salon to the left, wherein, I remembered, it had once been promised that Denis should devote a daily hour to the study of de Musset, de Dumas, and Victor Hugo. Whether he had ever done so, I doubted, but 2 walls of the room were book-lined. "Where is he?" I repeated. But at this very instant, hearing a step along the hall, I glanced up toward the door, and there, staring back frozenly at me, was Denis. It was a glimpse only that I had of him, for with a kind of indignantly affrighted "Ah!" he vanished. I rushed out after him into the hall, calling his name. A man, it was he who had let us in, stood there. "Dinner will be," he was beginning. "Where is my boy?" "Le jeune garçon," I interrupted him. "Which way did he go just now? Which is his room?" The fellow regarded me consideringly as he replied slowly, "The same, but—" He stopped, then, with a quick and as if guilty or surreptitious movement, crossed himself. Denis's old room was on the first floor, by the stairhead. Having run up to it, I tried the door, but it was locked, and there was no answer to my knocks. "Denis!" I cried. "Denis, are you there?" Not a sound. It was just possible, though most unlikely, that the door had been locked from the outside. I knocked and called again, in vain. Descending to the salon, I debated wretchedly. It appeared but too evident that Monsieur Vaignon had spoken truly, and that Denis had not ceased to regard me as his enemy. I recalled in misery the intonation of his "ah" when he caught sight of me some moments since. It had been an not merely of disconcertment and dismay, but I realized of actual execration. Monsieur Vaignon had come out into the hall. "You see," he murmured dryly, "I was right." At dinner no place was laid for Denis, and Monsieur Vaignon must have noticed my disappointedly inquiring glances. In the presence, however, of the ever-attendant Dorlot, as I gathered was his name, nothing of any importance could be said, and our talk was of trivialities. Meanwhile, my mind ran feverishly on what I had so far discovered. I had already seen, alas, enough to recognize that matters could not be adjusted offhand or hurried, and that the home-bringing of my poor prodigal would prove no simple and probably no brief procedure. There would be difficulties, especially in a foreign country, about compelling him forcibly to go with me, and in consulting with Monsieur Vaignon, and striving to come at the inner truth of the whole business, I must do what I could to practice greater patience and restraint. After the meal, I again followed Monsieur Vaignon into the salon, where he motioned me to a seat by the fire. "As you will doubtless have observed," he began immediately, anticipating one, though certainly not the most pressing of the questions that burned upon my tongue, "Marcel and Augustine are gone. They were, in all benevolence, snatched from me by an aunt, my sister-in-law, who considered the atmosphere here not altogether sympathetic to young children. Mon Dieu, how very right she was." My good resolutions at such words broke down, and I burst out, "And my child, monsieur? What about him? He wasn't at dinner with us. Where is he now? Is he safe now, this minute? When did he come here, and why? You have told me nothing yet. There is a person, a creature, Raoul, who—" "Ah, ça!" Monsieur Vaignon had raised a nervously, or it may have only been contemptuously, deprecating hand to check me. "Let us not speak that name too loudly. It is a name to me of ridicule and of annoyance. To others, many people whose susceptibilities one must regard of something infinitely worse. He paused, continuing presently. "You are bound, now that you are here, to hear of this nonsense, anyhow, and I may just as well prepare you and forewarn you. Enfin, it was of that, in fact, I wrote to you, or anyhow of that I was thinking, when I advised you in my letter not to send me your boy again." when I told you I was the victim of a persecution, as in a mood of some exasperation. I recall I did. I was hardly exaggerating, But, I broke in, I don't understand how... I hesitated, for my most urgent question would not be repressed. Is it here now? Monsieur Vaignon considered me warily. It, if we ought to call this damnable old wives' tale an it, is not here or active now. That is to say, enfin, it is not here now. After a moment he went on morosely. As for understanding, there are things of which one can perceive the effect upon oneself and others, but which one may not altogether understand, and may indeed in a sense entirely repudiate. As I've just told you, this nuisance, this most supreme and consummate nuisance, is not with us, actuellement. But your boy arrived here late last night in search of it. He is trying. He will do his best to get it back. It would be hard to describe the unhappy confusion into which these words had thrown me. What was I to believe? Monsieur Vaignon had alluded almost scoffingly to Raoul, as if to a sort of troublesome but relatively minor notifiable disease or garden pest, much as he might have spoken of some curiously periodic scarlatina or potato blight. Yet underneath his shrugging air I could define a genuine and continuing apprehension. He rose abruptly, with an access of agitation. This kind of molestation, or superstition of a molestation, is not entirely unexampled, if one may credit certain authors, certain boogie-mongers of at least 2 centuries and more ago. He had moved to the bookshelves, ran a finger along the tops of a few heavy-looking tomes, and half pulled one out. No matter, he said, pushing the volume into place again. It is there, and duly catalogued, though under an evasive appellation. They call these preposterousnesses, or the cast of mind that fostered and engendered them, son nom, simply that, the nameless. Undecidedly, he resumed his seat. I give you my word of honor that when I first met you, and until recently, this particular nameless had not, to my recognition, bothered us, or at all events, I do not deny that it or the rumor of it was supposed to have bothered us in the past, but it was presumed to be gone. Tant même, there was a technical and academic risk of which I might no doubt have warned you earlier. A tide of bewildered anger swelled in me. Yes, I said bitterly. Rumor or not, whatever the thing was, and whether we are mad or sane, you might indeed. You certainly should have warned me. Yes, you would have laughed, indirectly, or à moi, most excusably, at such history. You would have derided it, and me. And what would that have mattered if I had? I almost shouted, unable longer to contain the explosion of impatience. I had had to wait, on tenterhooks, all through the drive from Font, and then there through dinner, to ask anything of what I had been bursting desperately to ask, and now, when I could at last demand straightforward answers, I was treated to nothing but sidesteppings and prevarications. Monsieur Vaignon was silent, his head bowed. I was entirely convinced that he knew very well he had not told me the whole story, and was still keeping something back. This nameless, I insisted. What is it? I mean, this particular specimen. We're just beating around the bush about it all, and I can't in the least follow what it is you really think you're telling me. If you are telling me, what is it? That's what I've got to know. But whatever it is, you surely could have stopped my boy from meeting it. He told me it was something he chummed up with in the village, a kind of semi-vagrant, it sounded, but... My words trailed away. Monsieur Vaignon, his face white under my accusation, twirled his brandy, of which a glass was before me, too, untasted. He raised his own glass all at once and drained it. His expression showed an almost morbid exaltation. Ah, bah! It, you say it. Eh bien,
It is something, if you please, that ebbs and flows and that refuses to be satisfactorily dead. Something that crops up and comes and goes and is reputed to have plagued my family through 3 generations. Something that has nourished itself at intervals, so the tale runs, at our expense, and owes its very being and persistence to its victims. All that is in the textbook. We are not unique in this affliction. The so-and-sos you will hear, yes, a fine old family, but they have a sans nom. As for this particular example, as you say, it has a human shape, which you have seen. It eats, drinks, sleeps as other men, while it exists. Mon Dieu. It has even mended my edges and bought soap or tea or salt at the emissary before I suspected it until it was recognized. And then, when it was recognized, what a how do you do? But to exist, it must, as they say, have an attachment, and its attachment must be young. If and when its victim, its petite amie, dies, the pest transfers its attentions, we believe, to the children of another, and the nearest branch. The thing is amorous and rapacious. Nom d'un nom, quelle histoire, quelle fumisterie, quelle imbécilité, c'est ridicule, fantastique, incroyable.
His voice had risen wildly on a note. It might be equally of scorn or terror. As a knock, at first soft, then louder, was repeated on the door, the man Dorlo entered, wearing a look of remonstrance.
Monsieur should know that such excitement, of which the noise has penetrated to the kitchen, is very bad for him. Go to bed, monsieur. I advise it. Go to bed, where you may forget our troubles, possibly in sleep.
Meekly accepting the rebuke, and, I imagined, rather welcoming the excuse to escape further questioning, Monsieur Vaignon said to me,
Dolio is right, and if you will forgive me, I shall leave you now. My health, laterally, is precarious. Dolio will give you anything you require, but first, he turned to the man, where is the young monsieur? Is he in his room and quiet?
Yes, he is in his room, as is to be inferred from the very fact that his room is not entirely quiet. The noises are there again, while not as yet excessive.
My heart sank at these words, though they conveyed nothing new. The poltergeist disturbances, however, were connected in my mind with Raoul, and their continuance depressed me.
Good night,
said Monsieur Vaignon. I was desperately tired, but lingered a little longer in the library. What honestly could I believe, and what try still to disbelieve? Ordinarily, of course, the recital which my host had just concluded would be dismissible as a farrago of lurid and unpleasant nonsense, but I had had experience, alas myself, of what too plainly contradicted this consoling view. As I was going over what Monsieur Vaignon had said, and sipping my brandy at last, my eye fell on the volume he had started to pull out from the shelves. It protruded slightly still, and I got up and took it to my seat. Les gens d'autrefois, the tome was entitled tritely, but I had scarcely flicked over a haphazard page or two before I read as if my glance had been directed to the spot. Et c'est à dire, les morts, c'est régulièrement des vivants. I experienced a cold grue of that sort of surprise which is not surprise at all, but eerie confirmation, and immediately restored the volume. The dead shall feast upon the living. There it was, and I did not want at present to read more. It was the completion of the passage in that dream that I had had some weeks ago about my wife, holding the book before her non-existent face. I don't know what had made me so optimistic in leaving England as to the prospect of an early return there with my boy. No doubt I had the legal right to compel him to come home, but if he still repulsed me and offered physical resistance, the practical difficulties would be, to put it mildly, formidable. On the morning after my arrival, and throughout that day and the next, I had tried again to speak with him. But either his room would be locked and silent, or if I caught sight of him at all upon the stairs or in the grounds, he would take literally to his heels. "Where does he eat?" I asked,
for he continued absent from our meals, and it appeared that sometimes he would raid the larder and carry off his plunder to the fields. Neither Monsieur Vaignon nor his domestics had any control over him, and even if they had, I could not have relied on them to exercise it upon my behalf. As to the servants, they were in all respects so uncooperative as to be almost obstructionist, while in particular their extraordinary reticence caused me to think that they had probably been forbidden to gossip with me upon this or any other subject. How fervently I wished that Goderic were here. But of course he could not desert his patients at short notice, nor obviously was Monsieur Vaignon's hospitality in my gift. Denis, I found, had done as I had thought, and managed to stow away upon a fishing boat at Brixham. It had been evidently useless for him to pretend that his visit had my sanction, and he must have known I would eventually pursue him. But, beyond his infatuated determination to be reunited with Raoul at any cost, I doubted whether he could have had much of a settled plan of action and campaign. He had steered as clear as possible, it seemed, of Monsieur Vaignon, and so, as far as I could gather, had confided the manner of his crossing only, half inadvertently, to Dorleau, who had retailed the story subsequently to his master. It was a beautiful kettle of fish all round. I sent a wire to the police at Winchester, reflecting what slight satisfaction it had brought me thus to have proved them wrong. In my anxiety I had little or no help from Monsieur Vaignon. Either he was genuinely ill or feigned it to avoid my badgering. Never joining me at breakfast, he would retire, though with excuses, immediately after lunch and dinner, and since our talk on the first evening had said nothing to me of the least seriousness, sincerity, or moment as to what should have been our common problem. Left to my own devices, I would wander wretchedly around the estate and nearer villages, exchanging a bonjour occasionally with some peasant, but often meeting no one, as I chose the less frequented paths. The autumn days were dull, but now and then a brighter spell invited me to extend my rambles towards a pie that topped a line of rocky hillocks to the north. One afternoon, it was the 4th or 5th since my arrival, I had set out thither at about 3 o'clock. I paid no particular heed to where I was going, and walked on, I suppose, with my head bent in gloomy thought, for which I certainly had food enough. Yes, the position was fantastic, and a description of it, given baldly, would provoke only pitying disbelief. And yet the history was true. That was, I knew that as much of it as I had seen with my own eyes was true. As for the rest, for Monsieur Vaignon's wild, while half-contemptuous elaborations on the theme, I reserved judgment. He was a sick man, whatever the cause, and his troubles seemed reflected in the unprosperous, depleted and decayed condition generally of his estate and household. The chateau was in disrepair, and its staff, whether by flight or by dismissal, reduced to an uneasy remnant. Why, for example, had the trusted Flebard left? My heart was leaden with misgiving. Could Monsieur Vaignon, a diabolic suspicion flashed into my brain, could he initially have asked Denis to the chateau? Or anyhow have gone on having him there in order to safeguard his children? Could he at one time, to protect them, to divert something from them and fasten it on Denis, have actually been tempted to promote and foster the disastrous intimacy between Raoul and my boy? But I rejected such a vile hypothesis as altogether too far-fetched. My mind, as well, must be infected to have harbored it, and suddenly roused from my reverie, I looked about me. The country was unfamiliar and very lonely, and a small half-ruined church or chapel, with a graveyard attached, added to its general air of desolation. In that indifference of purpose which is born of mental exhaustion rather than of any, even idle, curiosity, I entered the graveyard and wandered aimlessly among its tombs. Some distance off, I noticed, a man was wending towards me down the road ahead. I loitered absently around the inside of the boundary wall. The burial ground was evidently disused, and the graves were untended, many overgrown with bramble or rank grass. Now and then a date caught my eye, 1830, 1813, 1770. Possibly all at once I stopped transfixed as in the silence a name stole staring back at me. It was inscribed upon a headstone slightly taller than the rest, though lichen-coated, tilted, cracked, and weather-worn as they. Visage. And just as decipherable below, yes, Raoul. Meureux, 1873. A footfall made me start,
It was the man I had seen on the ground and whose approach over the grass had been noiseless. He seemed a respectable, decent fellow of the sturdy bonhomme type, probably a small tradesman or petty farmer, but he was regarding me and the grave with a frown of somber disapproval. He gave a significant upward jerk of the head and pointed to the tomb.
Monsieur knows perhaps of whom that is the grave?
In a double disconcertment, I stammered faintly, "Yes, I know the... No, I cannot. I mean, it is the same name as somebody's I know." The man took a step backward, crossing himself, and said coldly,
"Enough. Then it is to be hoped that Monsieur knows also that it is a bad name. Alors, bonjour, Monsieur."
He was going slowly away from me, but on an impulse I detained him. "Why, who was he?" I asked. "Was he a criminal, or..." My tongue faltered, and as the man's glance met mine searchingly, it was as if 1,000 things had passed wordlessly between us.
"No, Monsieur. In life he was not a criminal, but..."
He paused, then stooping, traced with a forefinger the date 1873.
"That, Monsieur, was when he died. It is there, cut in a stone, and is, so far as it goes, correct. My father was mayor of the commune, and could remember all about it. I have even myself seen the burial record which was in the register of the parish before the amalgamation. I can tell you no more than that, if you please, Monsieur, that he died almost 80 years ago, in 1873.
Again he crossed himself, and this time, as he withdrew, I did not stay him. I was thrown momentarily into a kind of panic. In a sense, my talk several evenings since with Monsieur Vaignon should have prepared me for this further shock, yet I had still tended then, I think, to discount a good deal of his discourse as crazy ranting, which he had not repeated and probably repented. But now the story, borne out in another mouth, had gained fresh substance and solidity. Something, a mortuary breath of evil, had addressed me, subverting reason and defeating sanity. Raoul, if it were he, dead 80 years ago. Or what would lead this steady countryman and sober citizen thus to accost me so suspiciously and reprehendingly? Waiting only until he disappeared across a field, I walked quickly back to the chateau. That same evening I got Monsieur Vaignon's consent to my begging Goderic, if he could possibly arrange it, to join me at the earliest opportunity. I had spent 6 days here, quite uselessly. My boy remained obdurate in avoiding me, keeping out of doors as much as he could, and eating his meals I knew not when or precisely where. This could not go on indefinitely, and he must be removed somehow, but I did not feel confident of my ability to hale him home single-handedly, or wish either to invoke police assistance, French or British. I worded my letter to Goderic very strongly, and having posted it was slightly easier in mind. Otherwise, I was more tortured by anxiety than ever, and my discovery of the lonely grave had had a horrible effect on me. Coupled with the queer manner of the honest fellow who had spoken to me beside it, his doubting, fearful looks and his ambiguous reticence, it left me prey to a complete bewilderment and cold dismay. Of Denis, meanwhile, as I have just said, I caught only fleeting glimpses. Monsieur Vaignon, who had warned me that he, Denis, would try to get it back, pretended to have interceded with him, but on this I placed no least reliance. I had little real idea of what my boy did with himself all day, of whether he still slept in the same room, though I was assured this was so, or of when he fed or bathed or changed his clothes. As to this last point, I had brought with me for him some clean shirts, socks, and underwear, which I had handed to Dorleau, and were now, I was informed, in use. But generally it seemed to me his condition was one of almost semi-vagabondage, the chateau being for him not much more than a base or headquarters from which to forage in the countryside. However, the next morning I did have news of him which, while unreassuring, was somewhat more detailed than previous accounts. Denis, Dorleau remarked, had latterly been spending a good deal of his time in the east wing near the tower. But on my asking what my boy was doing there, the man had shrugged.
Qui sait, monsieur? I have seen him reading or carving wood with his knife.
Is he there now?
No, monsieur. It was yesterday and the day before. This morning he has gone out.
This conversation had been at my petit déjeuner, which I always had alone, my host preferring his brought to his bed. After the meal, I busied myself in writing a short note to my faithful Jenny, from whom I had heard 2 days ago. She had reported all well at home, and that she and Clara were both hoping, poor things, to welcome us both back very soon. I went out to post my reply to her, struck as I passed beneath the porte cochere by the chateau's latter-day appearance of neglect. It was as if it lay under a spell, as if some blight of doom and galloping decay attacked it. Yes, and assailed its inmates, too, I thought, one Colonel Walter Hapgood not excepted. I, to be sure, was only a temporary occupant of the place, a guest, yet I was conscious whenever I walked abroad that something of its ill repute attached to me. With the local peasantry, I, too, was in bad odor, the carrier of an aura, an aroma of the dimly sinister and menacing. And when I had mailed my letter to Goderic yesterday at the little office 3 kilos up the road to Fouant, whither I now again was on my way, the postmistress had eyed me balefully, touching her scapular as I was leaving. Go where I might, a species of anxious hostility attended me, expressed in covert stares, in sullen glances, crossings, and avoidances. Even the children scattered from my path. What was the truth, I demanded for the 100th time, about this whole fantastic business? These yokels, and Mr. Vaignon, I suspected, were abjectly superstition-ridden. You might suppose a recent world war would have knocked such sense out of them, but suddenly and wryly I laughed at myself, though it wasn't at all funny. Yes, that was rich, talk of the pot and kettle, for I was equally enthralled to a grotesque myth with any of the folk I was deriding. It was exasperating not to know quite what I did believe or disbelieve. Everything and everybody seemed to be conspiring to throw dust in my eyes and keep me ignominiously in the dark. Here was I, Denis's own father, thankful when I could pick up as just now a few crumbs of second-hand intelligence about him from a conceited surly menial like Dorleau. More than once latterly I'd been tempted to question the fellow bluntly about many things, but hitherto my pride had not allowed me to interrogate the man behind his master's back. As for the master aforesaid, Monsieur Vaignon, since his first outburst had retired completely into his shell and been as cordially informative as any oyster. I felt I could endure this mystifying and maddening secretiveness no longer. I must request from someone, anyone, a forthright explanation of the whole enigma, and see at least what sort of answer was provoking. Accordingly, when I had posted my letter to Jenny, I asked the postmistress to direct me to some person of responsibility, the mayor, perhaps, or schoolmaster, with whom I could discuss a private matter. The woman regarded me dirtily enough, replying only after a suspicious pause.
"The mayor is ill," she said, "but there is Monsieur Bourdillure, the garde champêtre, qui était de la Résistance, is ill likewise. Or Monsieur Tanvy, the pharmacien. Monsieur Tanvy," she added more amiably, "is very clever and of a great discretion, having been a quartermaster in the army. Then there is too, of course, Père Buendisson, the curé."
Rejecting the belauded Monsieur Tanvy, I decided on the curé, an obvious choice which it was strange had not occurred to me before. There was no difficulty in locating him. He had just returned from Mass and welcomed me into his vicary politely. Somewhat haltingly, I outlined as much as necessary of my story, including particularly of my discovery of the grave. Was, I inquired, the Raoul for whom my boy had this unfortunate infatuation a grandson, possibly, of the deceased? The curé's face had darkened, and at my final question wore a look of, as it were, a scandalized discomfiture. I was quite sure he had known all about me in advance.
"Franchement, monsieur, it is not easy to reply. This is a district assez superstitious, and, enfin, the individual whose grave you saw up there at Saint-Aurvin had no descendants. He was, it would appear, a butler at the chateau Vaignon, where actually he died. But that was 80 years ago, and—"
Yes, I said. "But this other fellow that my boy met, who is he?"
The good father blinked at me morosely. He was an elderly, florid-visaged man, with eyes that were worldly, but at the moment troubled and unsubtle.
"Monsieur," he said reproachfully, "you come to me like this and ask me, what, to confirm and to endorse a doubt that has beforehand been implanted in your mind, or maybe to deny it. I can state to you only that the visage we know of died in 1873. The rest is merely superstition."
"And the superstition is?" He shrugged weakly, uncomfortable and disdainfully apologetic under my pressure.
"Évidemment, the superstition you insist that I enunciate so clearly is that the visage who died in 1873 and he for whom you say your boy has this engouement are one and the same. C'est ridicule. Alors, and I have told you absolument all I can."
His manner, while still courteous, showed the beginnings of a self-protective frostiness, and again marveling, I felt defeated. All these folk, when you tried to tackle them and pin them down upon the subject of this preposterous myth, affected superiorly to scoff at it, yet all of them in their hearts were really scared of it. Thanking the curé, I took my dissatisfied and disappointed leave. I had been at the chateau just a week, an utterly, completely useless week. Each day I sought every chance of pleading with my boy, so far quite unavailingly. Must I then drag him home a literal captive and so make him hate me worse than before? Possibly, if need be, but not till I had tried every other, more persuasive measure. Denis was like a wild thing piteously spellbound and enchanted, and it would profit little, I thought, to trap and pinion the poor body if the spirit still eluded me. I wished to snare him, yes, but to snare the whole of him, and lovingly, and bonds and handcuffs seemed an unhappy way of doing this. Yet, if he would not voluntarily come with me, there was nothing for it but a degree of force, and it had been with this necessity in closer prospect that I appealed to Goderic, whose sympathetically auxiliary convoy at the pinch would certainly be less humiliating than that of a police escort. In this pass, Monsieur Vaignon was a broken reed, his nerve-racked inanition now indeed almost amounting to a kind of passive, undeclared resistance. And why, after exploding as violently as he had about his blessed sans nom, had he stopped short there? The curé had grudgingly enlightened me to the limit that his scruples or timidity allowed. But why couldn't Monsieur Vaignon have told me all this, and more himself? I walked to the window of my breakfast room and surveyed the autumn fields. From here they were visible in brown or sallow squares, stretching irregularly up a saucer's rim to misty hillocks. And in one of them, far off, I fancied with a start that I saw Denis. But no, the figure was motionless, and I remembered now that it was only a scarecrow, lingering purposelessly in the stubble. My letter should reach Goderic today, and if and when he came, we could hold some sort of council of war. How glad I would be of his refreshing sanity and clearer judgment. My own ideas had become quite chaotic, and my affronted reason hurled itself hour by hour against brick walls of contradiction. It was a veritable antimony. On the one hand, here was the mid-20th century, with, even in this backwater, the trains, post, newspaper, and radio, should Monsieur Vaignon but elect to buy a set, and an occasional avian droning overhead, while on the other, equally compulsive of assent, there lay sheer medievalism, rank mythology, a weird anachronism of fantastic horror. The two worlds, though interpenetrating, were irreconcilable, and each was true. I went undecidedly towards my room, and then passing it along a series of corridors. I had often roamed unchallenged up and down the chateau's twisting stairs, beneath its faded tapestries and seigneurial banners and across its echoing halls, and now uneasily, while unpremeditatedly enough, my steps trended in the direction of the east wing and its tower. Nothing in particular rewarded my reconnoitre, if it were one, though in a chamber just below the so-called haunted room I did find a few chips and shavings of the sticks, presumably that, as Dorleau informed me, Denis had been whittling. It was not till I had redescended that a speculation springing from my recent conversation with the curé crossed my mind.
Raoul, Père Puydisant, had stated had died in the chateau, and Denis, long ago, as I could now also remember, had said in speaking of the turret room that someone died there. Was the someone Raoul? And was it actually in the tower that he had died? It seemed more than probable. I spent the rest of the morning and most of the afternoon in desultory mooching, too anxious and distracted till at least I had Godric's reply to settle definitely to anything. My visit to the East Wing and my ensuing conjecture about Raoul had admittedly disturbed me, but beyond that I seemed dimly conscious of some other cause of a vague apprehension or dissatisfaction. It was something, I had the feeling, that had happened, or that I had briefly noticed during the course of the day, but which I could not quite lay finger on. Something of which the impact had been oblique and that now tapped irritatingly, with an obscure, persistent warning at my mind. For a long time I tried vainly to recall it, whatever it had been, then gave it up. I wandered restively into the library again, and took out the volume of legends, despite a kind of contemptuous repugnance to consider more attentively what it might have to say. Presently I found the passage I wanted. It was in a long section entitled simply Auvergne, and its immediate context was rather mystifying, too occult or too rhapsodical in diction for me to follow clearly. Regretting the inadequacy of my French, I read on, puzzled. Exceptional tenacity of life, enabling the said nameless to withdraw vital force. A line of two here that I could not make head or tail of. So to rebuild itself around the mammoth as around a nucleus or focus, and again a string of unfamiliar words defeated me. Or other homely object, so be it, to have the semblance of a man. But woe to all who do adventure thus, and whether child or woman, if the right fixative be not supplied. And then some sentences of what appeared to be a sort of general description. Their chief weakness being in the wrists and wattles, yellow above all they joy in, and a certain tint of bluish grey they do defy, wherefore, in extirpating them... Disappointed at my stumbling translation, I rested the volume open on my knee and pondered. In a sense, what I had managed to translate relieved me, because it seemed such errant puerile nonsense. Why, yes, I thought, in delighted welling of, as it were, half-hesitant, astonished thankfulness, it was all nonsense. Sheer, utter nonsense. And I could laugh at it. How had I ever... My fleeting elation ebbed. But Denis, I remembered. Yet, Denis... That was the trouble. Nonsense or no, my boy's plight was actual enough, and... My host entered, suddenly and brusquely. Owing ostensibly to his continued indisposition we had scarcely encountered for the last several days, and his face now wore a slight frown.
Bonjour, he greeted peevishly. I regret to see you so poorly entertained. You will hardly derive much profit or even amusement, I should think, from that.
To my amazement, he swooped upon the volume and replaced it smartly in the shelves. Really, Monsieur Vaignon was very trying, and it was now all in an instant that, as the result of this comparatively trivial incident, I found myself having an outright first-class row with him. No doubt on each side nerves were frayed to breaking point, and it had needed but this spark to set our tempers in a blaze. I had stood up. You might, monsieur, at least have had the courtesy not to snatch from my very knees a book that I was actually reading. He glared at me out of eyes swimming with tears.
"It is my book. It is my book," he repeated childishly, "and I shall do, as I believe you say, what I bloody well like with it. I am going to bloody burn it. There, monsieur, can you advance any argument against my bloody burning my own property, including the entire chateau if I see fit? And should anybody still insist on lingering, I say, in this so charming chateau of mine when I burn it, he will be burnt too, neck and crop along with it, unless—"
Staggering, he had clapped a hand to his breast.
Forgive me. I am desolated to have made such an exhibition of myself and caused you to think of me like a stage Frenchman. n'est-ce pas? But certain things in this establishment are not quite as they should be. A large, an infinitely large blue bottle has got loose in my bedroom and kept me awake all night. And I, too, am, as your son nom, weak in the wrists and wattles.
Was he going mad? Or shamming mad? My son nom? I was really completely disgusted with him, the more so perhaps because he had somehow succeeded, in this ridiculous fashion, in taking the wind out of my sails. This creature of yours, whatever it is, I was startled to hear myself shouting, this precious son nom of yours, I say, that has attacked my boy, and that for some reason you'll tell me nothing more about. He died here, didn't he? Up in the tower room, or under it? Monsieur Vaignon regarded me at first uncomprehendingly, and then almost as if pityingly.
My poor friend, he said slowly. My poor friend. All this has been too much for you, and you are going crazy. Mon Dieu, c'est le comble, ça.
He approached nearer with a curious dancing step, and to my utter dumbfounding snapped a finger and thumb beneath my nose.
I repeat it, monsieur. I repeat with inexpressible regret that you are quite demented.
I had backed from him, far too bewildered to feel insulted by the taunting words and gesture, and it was at this instant that, as at a previous somewhat similar crisis, the tall form of Dorlo filled the doorway.
Comment-vous, mon maître?
He remonstrated.
Comment-vous? It is this heavy weather that surcharges the nerves, but to yield to your temperament in this manner and with these antics is unseemly. Calmez-vous, thank heaven, he added in a lower tone. It cannot last much longer now.
Monsieur Vaignon looked at us wildly.
Forgive me, he murmured again. Forgive me.
A strange expression, a sort of leering, still half-impudent despair flickered over his features as, turning, he let Dorlo lead him unsteadily away. I stayed motionless where I was a full minute. The whole scene had been incredible, and my bedlam had flowered unashamed before my eyes. At length, dazedly, I walked from the house. Outside, I recovered. That was, my immediate emotional disturbance gradually died down. But I felt exhausted, as if I'd been through a fight or in a melee, and my fundamental apprehension and confusion were increased. It is a nightmare, I thought. A nightmare. That is why everyone appears mad, and why you yourself behave like a madman. All at once you will wake up, perhaps when Goderic comes. The air, as Dorlo had observed, was close and muggy. It was mild, but with a treacherous intimation of tenseness. Of I did not quite know what. The fields stretched round me passively. Too passively, I fancied oddly, as if conspiring or abandoned to a gathering sly enchantment. They rolled in their meek rectangles of ochre, dun, and beige, up to unstirring foothills, dreaming a guileful dream. Crossing one of them, I remarked idly that the scarecrow I had noticed earlier from the salon window seemed to have altered its position slightly. Monsieur Vaignon, good heavens, son nom, his, if you please, not mine. I wished him joy of them. Son nom, ye gods, who would have invented such bogies, such farcically loathsome things, unless... I raised my eyes to the gray-baited sky and shivered. No, I was not, to word it temperately, much enamored of this devil's nook, this baleful 12th or 13th century pocket of provincial France, where superstitions and obscene mythologies, instead of just remaining quaintly decorative, had the unpleasant trick of springing suddenly alive and driving mad all those who brooded on them overlong. If only... My disjointed ruminations petered out. Once more I raised my eyes with a faint shudder. All about me as I walked, the hills, the waiting fields, kept quiet pace with me. I was aware, how shall I put it, of a bland banking up, of a demure stealth, a kind of tiptoe ripening of something. My head ached, and I had an indescribably oppressive feeling. The chateau, from the spot where I had now come rather giddily to a halt, was visible, maybe a kilo off, but partially obscured by a dip and by a thin belt of trees. I would get back to it as quickly as I could in case my disagreeable symptoms should increase. Slowly I proceeded, conscious upon my mental palate of some recrudescent flavor that was dimly nauseous and half familiar. I had covered perhaps a third of the distance to the chateau when a dog ran up behind me, whining. It was one of the 3 or 4 dogs of the house, an amiable enough little creature, mainly poodle, called Gigi. Denis had been fond of it, and I supposed it still companioned him in his present gypsy-ish style of life. But now it appeared distressed or frightened, and slunk whimpering and cringing at my heels. We went on together, skirting a field of stubble. It was the field containing the useless scarecrow, and again, puzzled, I had the impression that the object had moved slightly, in the direction of the chateau. Hang it! I thought querulously, in a sort of mild, annoyed perplexity. This was preposterous, and I must previously have misjudged the confounded thing's position. Gigi, beside me, cowered closer and gave, very low, a series of curious, suppressed yelps. The day had grown overcast, and my headache was no better. I had a sense of something brewing, something making, a kind of dumbly guarded watchfulness or wakefulness in the dull air, the trees, the hilltops, and the whelming sky, as if they too were, like myself, alerted and upon some strange and semi-animate qui-vive. The dog, while we passed opposite the middle of the field, darted for a moment from me and through the hedge, venting 2 stiff little barks of actual terror, or of a variety of canine scandal. Gradually, as we neared the house, my head ached less, yet a conviction of uneasy imminence, a presentiment of swiftly gathering evil, knocked still at my mind's door, and again, more fervently, I longed for Goderic. I entered the chateau, and there, on a tray in the hall, lay an answer to my prayer. Yes, said the telegram, he could come, on Tuesday. That was in 3 days' time. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Feasting Dead by John Metcalfe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 4. This heartening news was confirmed in a letter from him the next morning, explaining that he would have joined me instantly had not his partner been somewhat indisposed and hardly capable, till the promised Tuesday, of shouldering the extra work. Well, it was more than I had had the right to hope that my friend should have been able to arrange to get away at all, and, heaven knew, I blessed him. During the weekend, however, my feeling of tension increased, and was appreciably heightened, as it happened, by my host's ill humor. Monsieur Vaignon, after our recent row, had offered me a somewhat grudging apology for his rudeness, but now he was exasperated again upon a different score. While I had had from Goderic a cheering and reassuring letter, he had received, it seemed, a violent and upsetting one. The aunt, he told me, with whom Le Petit has been staying, had written saying she was compelled to visit Tunisie on business. It might be for several months, and must accordingly send her brother-in-law's children home.
It is an excuse, he fumed. Business, pah! They cannot come here yet, not yet.
My sympathy for him, when I remembered the plight of my own boy, was not excessive, and privily I blamed no aunt for getting sick of young Marcel and Augustine, but the matter set my mind running with the revival of curiosity on the connection, or, in the case of Denis, actual relationship, between our respective families, for it was through the sister of this same discredited and disobliging lady that it existed. She had been, before her marriage to Monsieur Vaignon, a Mademoiselle Drouard, and by a common ancestor 3 generations back, a cousin, though I do not think they knew each other, of my wife's. This train of thought led naturally to a reconsideration of the whole question of Monsieur Vaignon's conduct and attitude throughout, and here I was, as far as ever, from a satisfactory conclusion. He had blown hot and cold, and been by turns solicitous and callous, courteous and grossly impolite. He had been contrite enough, if it were that, to break off the holiday exchange arrangement, yet insufficiently honest to warn me plainly about Raoul. He had had the grace, later, to wire me twice after Denis had run away to France, but then, when I arrived for the retrieval of my truant, had given me no help. There was no making the man out. I had been puzzling alone upon the Saturday evening over these and allied problems when I heard a confused noise of angry shouting. The sounds seemed to come from the direction of the stables, suggesting by their volume and persistence that several persons, possibly a dozen or so, were engaged in a violent fracas. But by the time I had gone out to look, just as the hubbub had rather suddenly subsided, the disputants must evidently have stopped their fight and scattered. Crossing the basse-cour, however, I saw a man limping painfully and holding a blood-stained rag to his face. I recognized him as a fellow I had noticed driving one of the wagons that carried hay, or milk and butter from the laiterie, and might have asked him what the trouble was had I not at that moment caught from somewhere within the shrilly furious tones of Monsieur Vaignon. As to this incident, it was again from Dorleau that I received enlightenment, incomplete though it was. His master, who made no allusion to the matter, having retired immediately after dinner, he, Dorleau, brought me my customary glass of lonely brandy in the library, and said, "That parcel of rascals from St. Irvyne were after Baptiste and your boy this afternoon, and nearly had him too." "What?" I exclaimed, alarmed. "After my boy? What for? Is he all right?" The man replied coldly, addressing the ceiling, it appeared, rather than me. "The young monsieur is entirely unharmed, since they were unable to catch him. But Baptiste, that one, he certainly got a scratch or two." "But why should they be attacked?" Dorleau shrugged, spreading his hands. "People here, monsieur, are superstitious. They are believers in all kinds of nonsense, and possibly the young monsieur had been doing something quite inadvertently which caused them to suspect him, sans dire, most wrongfully, of dealing in such matters. I cannot tell. Enfin, the two of them, he and Baptiste, were pursued by this band of ignoramuses and ruffians into our very yard, where they found refuge. It is unfortunate," he added as if meditatively, "that certainly even of our own servants too should take sides with this rabble. Enough, it is no longer my affair, or properly my concern. I leave this place tomorrow." I was exceedingly disturbed, not only by Dorleau's story and its implications, but also, if to a less degree, by his announcement of departure. It would have been foolish to regard him as an ally, yet he had not been actively hostile, and latterly had constituted almost my only source of news concerning Denis. As to the tale itself, more lay behind it, obviously, than Dorleau would disclose, but of this I could guess at a good deal. Amongst the peasantry, Denis would but too naturally be a prime object of suspicion, and it was really a wonder he had evaded molestation, if he had, till now. The man Baptiste, surmisably, had been his friend or his associate, and fallen, consequently, under the same stigma. Evidently the business had attained the proportions of a feud, and Monsieur Vaignon's ranks within the chateau had been split. Dorleau, I fancied, would not lack company upon the train tomorrow. While I was counting the hours to Godric's arrival with a fresh sense of urgency, I renewed vainly my efforts to lessen Denis's hostility. I no longer hoped now for a full reconciliation so speedily, but, short of that, I would have liked, before Godric lent me what help he could, to be at all events on speaking terms with my own child. Twice I tried to talk with him through his locked door, receiving on the first occasion no reply, and on the second the response, "Oh, go away, I hate you." And twice, also, I got within undignified hailing distance of him in the grounds, only to be humiliated by his almost offhandedly contemptuous flight. Obviously, at any time I might probably have rallied Monsieur Vaignon's odds and ends of still faithful retainers, a further couple had left with Dorleau in the morning, to round up my quarry and then forced him, as my prisoner, to parley. But such trappings or waylayings would have been very much against the grain, and, as I saw it then, have done more harm than good. What, I would wonder, could be his view of the position? How, in his own opinion, was he faring? Pretty evidently he had expected, or at least hoped, to find his odious playmate here, and had not Monsieur Vaignon told me that he, Denis, would do his best to get Raoul back? In that, however, so far as I could judge, he had been disappointed. What had become of the physical Raoul, of the physical aspect of him, I had no idea.
Presumably after my half-throttling of him, he had returned somehow to France, but had not yet, I trusted, reappeared in his old haunts. Upon this point I could have, to be sure, no certainty, but whoever or whatever the creature was, its headquarters seemed to lie on this side of the channel, and the next step of minimum precaution was to transport Denis to the other. Monday, and tomorrow Goderic would be here. Indeed, a letter for him, aux soins de Monsieur Vaignon, had rather surprisingly preceded him already, arriving together with one from me from Jenny. The weather was still gloomy, rainless but boding, and again I strolled dejectedly around the nearer fields. The landscape, as before, was sere and sullen, but its mood to my imagining had subtly changed. The sense of stealthy ferment and evil quickening had departed, and the drab acres had an empty look, as if delivered or relieved of something. Loth to accuse myself of being over-fanciful, I stared about me, seeking for anything that might account more factually for this impression, but could find nothing. Merely the scarecrow I'd noticed formerly had gone, having been removed and set up for whatever none too obvious reason, as I subsequently discovered, in another field considerably closer to the house. I wandered slowly back to the chateau. Help was at last at hand, for Goderic should be here tomorrow evening. Yet my heart was curiously unlightened. The countryside, lowering in secret, with that discharged and voided aspect of an ominous fulfillment, seemed to wear a mien of hidden ridicule, of some kind of deceptive somnolence and inward mockery, as though it were laughing at me up its sleeve. Nonsense, I tried to think. What utter nonsense. With a derisive, apt theatricality, a trio of stage property bats, encouraged by the dusk, skimmed past me as I turned by the corner of a barn. And then suddenly I had a shock. "Hello, Daddy," said Denis. He was there, in front of me, shyly smiling and addressing me in this form he had discarded for some years as babyish. His clothes were stained and torn, and his cheeks wan under their grime. I did not believe he had washed properly for days. But it was far less his ragamuffin air that horrified me than his manner. It was flat and almost bored, yet confident, casual and unconstrained in some utterly wrong way, as though he were so tired out with whatever he had been up to that he had forgotten even what it was. How could he else have carried it off with this weary, this, to me, actually hideous aplomb? He stood gazing at me in a sort of forlorn and rather vacant friendliness, as if nothing had happened, as if he were completely unconscious of my misery or his own. "Come in," I think I said to him, and talk things over, shall we?"
"Yes,"
he replied absently.
"All right. I'm hungry, too."
He paused, then added reconsideringly, and as a careful qualification,
"That is, not really very—"
We had begun to walk on from the barn, and the fading light shone briefly on his face, discovering there a look that sickened me but is not easy to describe. It was at once wily and exhausted, an expression, so to speak, of a supreme irrelevance or imperviousness to the situation, of a precarious unconcern and hard frivolity or falsity. A falsity all the worse for being undeliberate and still childish. My gorge rose as at something odious. Rage filled me, and, to my dismay, I found my fist clenched to strike him. It was with the greatest effort that I controlled the impulse. "Denis," I heard myself saying. "Denis." My anger had turned suddenly to yearning, and I had him unresisting in my arms. He was light as a feather, limply yielding and weighing nothing, almost nothing. I felt while I strained him to me, as if he were liable at any instant to melt away from my embrace into thin air. At the chateau, when we entered, Monsieur Vaignon had just come into the hall, gaping at us as though quite confounded. I do not really know how the next few hours passed, what words were said or what was done in them. I do know and remember that they were not happy or triumphant hours. Alas, far from that. A deep emotional conviction of impending sorrow or calamity persisted, and I could not banish it. Superficially, it was to the good that the pursuits, the trappings, and lassoings I had envisaged were dispensed with. Yet, what had I instead? Not Denis. That was the trouble. It was only the curious shell of him I had. He was a wanling, almost a changeling, something that most horribly denied each trait and feature of the Denis I recalled, and of which the contemplation could but be agonizing. Nonetheless, as I say, this unexpected turn of events was a practical simplification. Presumably, Denis would come quietly and not have to be dragged home a prisoner. Goderic, when he arrived, would have nothing to do but go back with us again. And then... "Are you tired?" I believe I asked once. "After all the camping out?" He regarded me queerly, head cocked, with the suspicious, quasi-intelligent incomprehension, the notion visited me dreadfully, of a parrot. A little. Yes, a little." That was all, but the manner, if not the matter, of the reply had remained vaguely hostile, and violently unsatisfactory. His tone held a deplorable sort of cunning, or of fancied cunning, as if, despite his sudden yielding, he still had an ace hidden somewhere in the pack, or thought he had. What had prompted his surrender? Had he merely wearied of roughing it and craved the ordinary home comforts he had missed now for 3 weeks? Had his designs, whatever was their nature, been frustrated or miscarried, so that at last he had had to give them up? Or had he possibly decided that my reinforcement by Goderic, of whose coming, apart from servants' gossip, he could have got wind in any case from the letter in the hall, would be too much for him, and that he might as well cave in to me right away? I must wait to find out all that, for the time was not propitious yet, I felt, for direct catechizings. Fortunately, perhaps, for that event, at any rate, this question did not arise, as Denis professed himself so drowsy that, as soon as he had had his tea, and then a bath, he went to bed. Of Monsieur Vaignon, save for his startled apparition in the hall, I had seen nothing since lunch. I dined alone, and, after a couple of pipes in the petit salon, was glad to get up to my room. Denis and I, reflected, had forgotten, or at least, perhaps on both sides semi-deliberately, omitted to say good-night to each other. I wondered whether he were yet awake, or, if his sleep were half as troubled as I feared likely in his father's case, what dreams would visit him. Next day I was in 2 minds about taking Denis with me to the station to meet Goderic, deciding finally against it. I did not think he would slip off again, and if he did, it would only prove his capitulation, no real capitulation after all. As to that, indeed, I still felt something disquietingly planned or spurious in it, but my misgivings did not include now any apprehensions of his renewed and literal bolting. Nothing much had happened during the morning. Monsieur Vaignon, encountering me just before lunch, congratulated me, with a deathly simper, on my improved entente with Denis, and made no difficulties over lending me the car, which I was mightily relieved he did not propose to drive this time himself. Goderic would stay 1 night at the chateau, and tomorrow the 3 of us would return to England. I pictured my friend's surprise when he learned of the fresh development. In a sense, he would have had his journey for nothing, but I didn't think he would mind that. A wire yesterday evening might just have caught and stopped him, but actually Denis's unexpected surrender had put everything else out of my head, and I was selfishly glad now that it had. At the station, I had still 10 minutes to wait, and outside the yard entrance to the baggage office, I noticed a wagon drawn up, and a long box being unloaded from it and then carried in to the clerk. The wagon I could recognize as from the chateau, and the fellow awkwardly shouldering the box was, I was pretty sure, that same Baptiste I had seen limping with the blood-stained kerchief to his face in the basse-cour 2 days ago. As he climbed again into his seat, the chef de gare himself came out to confer for a few moments with him in an undertone. But here at last was Goderic's train. It had scarcely clinked puffing to a standstill before he leaped out and clasped my hand in his.
"Well," he was saying, "it's rather like one's toothaches fleeing on the dentist's doorstep. If I hadn't come for nothing, as you are so kind as to suggest, you and your young jackanapes would probably still be at loggerheads."
We were approaching the chateau, and I wondered. Goderic's hearty vigor, his very tone of cheerful lightness, was a gust of health and hope from another world, and yet I doubted, and was even somehow shocked. "If we're not still at loggerheads, as it is," I remembered answering, "you'll see for yourself presently." We drove under the porte cochere and alighted. Monsieur Vaignon was there to greet us, all politeness.
A small dim figure hung back, hugging the shadows.
"Hello, scallywag," called Goderic.
"Aye, come out of that." Denis moved forwards undecidedly. His face again horrified me by its hollow wanness.
Goderic commented. "Not altogether a walking advertisement of anything, I must say. That's the deserts of being AWOL. 19 days adrift, eh? But we won't clap him in the glasshouse this time, Sergeant Major."
Once more I gave a mental gasp. I did not know whether to admire or be scared out of my wits by Goderic's breeziness. Wasn't it, I misdoubted, a trifle overdone? It jolted me, I think, not so much through a fear of its effect on Denis, as by appearing almost too temerarious, a defiance of the evil gods. But Denis did not seem to mind this joshing. He even smiled faintly as Goderic persevered with his hearty badinage and ate, under the friendly bombardment, a reasonably good tea. None the less, I could divine beneath his fun poking that Goderic was concerned. When Denis had gone off to see the horses fed, he said, with Gigi, my friend's expression became grave.
"What do you make of this, Hapgood?" he surprised me by inquiring.
Why, I want you to tell me."
"Of course, but first I'd be interested in your opinion so far as you have any. Do you, for instance, really—" He broke off. "Wait a bit. Are we likely to be disturbed here? Our perfect host isn't liable to butt in, is he?"
"I shouldn't think so. He's completely haywire these days, and we probably won't see him again this evening."
"Suits me. And if—"
But at this moment, to falsify my prophecy, Monsieur Vaignon did butt in, insisting upon entertaining us, with the most oddly vapid small talk, until and throughout dinner, and it was only when he had at length proffered his excuses and retired that I and Goderic could continue our discussion. Denis himself, as on the previous night, had gone early to his bed.
"Well," Goderic resumed, "what is your feeling about the whole thing now? For example, and putting a conceivable crack-brained impersonation out of it, as I think we may, do you actually believe that the pernicious loon we both knew down in Hampshire is the same Prevost whose grave you've said you saw near here last week?"
It certainly sounds nonsense," I replied.
"Nonsense, yes, naturally it does. But even nonsense can be dynamic. In its proper realm, where its writ runs and it holds sway, it isn't nonsense, and it can often effectually intrude into a sphere beyond its own. It has become at least mentally real for Denis, and also up to a point for you. I just wanted to know how real."
"I tell you, I don't know. It simply doesn't add up."
"All right, it doesn't. If it did, for instance, this damned Salidor could eventually be detraced and be run in for something. But for what exactly? In what terms could you prefer a charge? I'd hate to see you trying."
"The notion would be quite absurd, which just shows you that it can't add up for us in any ordinary way. But the next obvious practical step, anyhow, is to get your boy as clear of it all as we can, and pray that later he'll, respond to treatment. But what do you think, honestly, is—"
I faltered. "I know what you're going to ask. Well, is it? Or, again, is it? How can I tell? It was there, that precious Gaby was, and it appeared to be more or less passably a man. And for some revolting reason it wore mittens. Also, it had an arm which acted up pretty unorthodoxly. What I don't see is how a mere throttling, a semi-throttling, could have snuffed it out and kiboshed it, at all events temporarily, as it seems to have done. No doubt that rubbed in the fact that it wasn't too popular and would be a deterrent to some extent, but—"
Goderic too hesitated, then went on.
"I don't fancy we can get much forwarder along those lines. It's easy enough to say the whole thing's farcical, and if you could feel that as well as say it, it would be fine. What about the poltergeist noises? Do they still go on?"
"I was told so. I've not heard them here myself."
"And the haunted room where you're persuaded the original Fee-Faw-Fum demised, how does that come into it? Did our host admit definitely that Prevost No. 1 had died there?"
"Definitely. No, indeed. He's never said anything definite or straightforward. When I did, as it were, challenge him to deny that the The first visage had died where I felt he had. He just behaved quite weirdly and was abominably rude and accused me of going mad. For some while longer, our talk continued without leading us to any more concrete conclusion than we had reached already, that our sole hope for Denis lay in getting him away immediately, and that when this was done, it would be only in the nick of time. We had thought, Goderic and I, that we were bringing Denis home, and that morning we treated our precious freight as if no precaution for its safety could be excessive. Denis was actually, and in literal truth, so worn and wasted that such an attitude would have been natural in any case, and I think we both felt that unless the greatest care were exercised, he might, as it were, collapse in our hands or be blown away by a puff. His eyes were lusterless and his skin dry, and his manner held some ingredient I could not define, at once apathetic and expectant, or perhaps apprehensive. The day had broken cloudily after, for me, a restless night. I had had dreams, but could not recall them clearly. Mostly they had been of absurdities, of Monsieur Vaignon addressing a meeting of puppets in the library, of Dorlot roller skating somewhere overhead, and even of the ridiculous scarecrow shifting from field to field in a continued march towards the house. But their persisting savor was oppressive, and I had woken from them with nerves jangled. Our train was to leave Fouant at about 10:30, and we had risen, we realized, rather unnecessarily early. Denis, glancing at us distraitly from under lowered brows, ate an extremely sketchy breakfast. Once he appeared lost in a kind of reverie, and then, arousing from it with a start, upset his chocolate bowl. The slight mishap caused him to open his mouth aghastly in an unuttered scream. This time we wouldn't need our host's car. I had arranged yesterday for a taxi to come out for us from Fouant, and now I prayed it might be punctual. Our luggage was stacked in the hall. I had tipped the servants, and Monsieur Vaignon, dressing-gowned, had made a grisly mountebank descent to say goodbye. Bowing and stiffly shaking hands, he muttered something else that sounded like, "If it will let you." At last the three of us drove off. For a while my spirits lightened, and I breathed more freely. "Are you all right?" I asked Denis.
"Oh, yes."
He was next me and facing Goderic, gazing dreamily, or raptly, out of the window. His expression was remote, as though he were attending to something we could not see, or not appreciate. His hair, I noticed, had grown long and wanted cutting. Suddenly, from under his seat issued a low bark. Gigi. How he had managed it, I did not know, but the little creature must have leaped in after Denis, and we should now have to ask the station-master to restore him to his owner. This, on alighting from the taxi, we did, and presently the train drew in. Denis, for a second or two, as Goderic and I were about to board it, was not to be found, and my heart froze. But next moment he came scurrying from the direction of the consigne, and clambered in with us just in time. I was so thankful at retrieving him. A passion of yearning sympathy for my poor darling rose in me, and I pressed his arm. The train gathered speed, and I remember sighing in relief, and thinking that every mile now was a mile further towards his safety. Actually, I had hardly expected or quite dared to hope we would ever do it, ever get away. I had feared all the while that something, though I couldn't guess how or what, would happen or put out a hand to halt us or detain us, some sort of accident or hitch, But my satisfaction ebbed and died. Denis's manner suddenly alarmed me. He was distressed. I could not tell why.
The scare.
He seemed to be trying unsuccessfully to say something, then changing to French, at length got out,
"L'épouvantail sédant."
He paused and added with an urgency I could not understand the one word,
"Gigi."
Sure enough, to my annoyed confusion, the dog was there, and with us still, whether or not with Denis's abetting I did not know. But it was not the dog's presence I was bothered over. It was the curious looks and bearing of my boy. Another train, which must be an express, was overtaking us, coming up rapidly upon a parallel track. Our own train, as if inspired to a race, increased its speed, and the express gained on us less swiftly. Gigi had burst in upon us, at first delightedly from the corridor, wagging his tail, but now appeared strangely subdued. With a short bark of half-hearted challenge, he slunk cowering under the seat by Denis. "What is it, Denis? What's the matter?" I implored. Goderic had pulled out a brandy flask and held it to Denis's lips. They moved slowly and bewilderedly.
L'épouvantail. The scarecrow. C'est...
Suddenly he broke from us, moaning, and dashed into the corridor. Both I and Goderic had grabbed at him ineffectually. The dog, as though torn between its fear and a kind of loyalty, had emerged from under the seat and stood whimpering in the doorway. Thrusting it aside with my boot, I followed Denis. The express was quickly overhauling us. I could just see at the moment the front of its locomotive showing level with the corridor's end, then creeping foot by foot along our windows. "Denis! Denis!" I repeated. "What is it? What are you doing?" He was hunched oddly, staring out at the other train with a quite indescribable look of terror on his face. His eyes were round with fright, and his body was pressed desperately against the corridor's inner wall, as if, despite his fascinated interest, he were trying to get as far from the pursuing coaches as he could. What followed has an outre horror and grotesqueness which puts such a strain on ordinary credence that even I who witnessed it still find it hard, if not impossible at times, to reconcile with or accept as literal truth. I cannot in any way explain it, but I believe now that something then went hideously wrong. Went wrong from Denis's and Raoul's point of view, I mean, and that whatever sort of ghastly schemes and machinations may have been afoot were, at the last moment, bungled. What I did see, or what at all events I seemed to see, was the result, I feel, of some bizarre and odious miscarriage. I had caught Denis's arm and shook it, but he paid no attention to me. Two men on the farther side of him stuck curious heads out of their compartment and gaped foolishly at us. Behind me, squeezed up in the narrow passage, Goderic was shouting over my shoulder above the uproar of the trains. "Come on, young man, snap out of it, come back!" His voice was cool, but he added in my ear, "For heaven's sake, get hold of him somehow." Denis had wedged himself against the jamb of a half-open door, and it was now, as I was struggling in the cramped space to wrest him from it, that our own pace abruptly slackened, so that the express began to flash by our windows at a rush. I learned later that it was then that Goderic had pulled the communication cord. Meanwhile, I still could not drag Denis free. I was aware that he was in some awful danger, but tugged at him in vain. As in a nightmare, I strained till the sweat stood on my forehead, praying that the dream would break. It never did, or has. For an instant I had looked out of the window. The guard's van of the express was just passing us. Something, a long box like a coffin, cocked lewdly up and protruding slowly from it, flew out of it towards us and crashed against us. The corridor was littered with shivered glass. The train had stopped with a violent jolt. People were running along the track, and already I caught from somewhere amazed exclamations.
"Oh, épouvantail! It was in that box there, solely a scarecrow!"
I turned again to Denis, thinking I had heard his call. Gigi, I fancied he had said. But what had happened to the dog I did not then or later know or care. My boy's face was seamed and wizened as that of an old man, and the starkest terror was graven on it. His body was now quite limp in my hands. Goderic and I carried him back to the compartment and laid him on a seat, and it was then I saw that before his last cry, his hair, which had changed to elf locks, had gone white. End of Chapter 4. And End of The Feasting Dead by John Metcalfe.